Hey there, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Dr. Susan Pierce Thompson. I'm here with my dear friend Everett Considine. Hi, Everett.
Hello, Susan. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, let's see who's here. Let's take a look at this chat thread. We've got Alana from Yukon, Canada. We've got Joanne and Harlan wondering if it started yet. We've got Angela Stair from North Carolina, Pat from Reno, Nevada, Lisa from Germany. Hey, Lisa. We've got MK from Virginia. We've got Paula from Kansas, Sarah from Ontario, Canada, Katya from Germany, Kay from Washington, Susanna from Finland. Hi, Susanna from Finland. Amazing. Yeah, this is the time of day when we get a more international crowd because it's 3 p.m. Eastern, which is a good time of day in Europe. It's a good time of day in Australia. So we get people. Here's someone else from Finland. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce your name right, but I'll try. Eusbiu. I don't know if that's Eusebiu. Oh, I wish you were live to tell me how to pronounce your name. We got Pat from Jamaica. We've got Stephanie from Germany, Bonnie from South Carolina, Amy from Salt Lake City, Beverly from Israel. Amazing. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right. We're going to get going here in a second. When I start some science that I'm going to present, I'm going to mute the chat thread, but for just a minute, we'll let it stay open. And Josie from the UK, and oh my goodness, someone's from Jordan.
Wow.
Amazing, beautiful. My friend Ocean Robbins, his favorite place in the world is the hot springs in Jordan. There's these certain hot springs that are supposed to be amazing. I can't wait to go. Liv from Norway, and Margaret from Norway, and Rita from Scotland. Amazing. Look at all these people here. Amazing. What an international crowd we have today. Wonderful. David from Boise. Awesome. Myra says, this is not live, ? No, it is. It is. We're live. We're right here. We're right here, live in real time, right here with you. Everett's in Maui right now. What time is it for you, Everett?
Oh, it's early. It's 9 a.m.
And I'm in Rochester, New York. It's 3:06 p.m. right now. No, this is absolutely live, Myra.
There's Eileen from Hawaii.
Oh, sweet. Sweet. Nice. All right. Lyndon Morris Del Rio says, bonjour, mon ami. Beautiful. Yes. All right. So, Julia Carroll's here. Hey, Julia. Grass Valley in the house. Love it. Donna says your words are repeating or echoing. Is that true for others too? Is everybody hearing that? Is everybody hearing my words echoing? Because if that's the case, I got to figure out a way to fix that. Hi, Kirsten from New Zealand. Sharon from South Australia. Claudia from Cyprus. Oh my goodness, we have such an international crowd today. This is incredible. Incredible. No echoing. Okay. For most people, it's not echoing. Okay, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
Echoing for me.
Audio is fine. Okay. No echo in East Texas. Glad to hear it. Okay. Perfect. So welcome, everyone. Just welcome. Thank you for taking this slice of time. We know how precious your time is. Thank you for arranging your day and carving out this time to be with us. We're going to be talking today about how to get unstuck in life and in a bright line eating journey. And with a couple of problems in particular, the problem of getting stuck in food cravings, food obsession, having a part that really wants to eat and then having a part that clamps that down, and then having a sense of shame or beating yourself up inside your own head. Or really being stuck in general with just about anything, whether it's getting stuck in loops of procrastination or getting stuck in relationships where you keep playing out the same patterns. Turns out that getting stuck in life, all these different scenarios, as different as they are, they have common similarities. And the path out that we're going to propose today is one common path out. And, I remember when I started teaching people bright line eating, at that point in my journey, I was already 20 years into sobriety. And that meant 20 years of working the 12 steps, 20 years of mentoring others along a spiritual path of psychological and emotional healing. I'd already been a professor teaching psychology for 13 years. I probably had about 20 years of therapy under my belt at that time. And through all these modalities, I built up a certain comfort inside my own skin. I'd worked through a lot of issues. And I started coaching people in bright line eating, not across the board, but it kept coming up over and over and over again that I would hear people be really harsh to themselves inside their own heads, really harsh. They would say things like, I hate myself, or I keep failing at this. I'm such a failure, or things like that. The language that they would use about themselves would slip out, and I would feel really concerned for them and wounded hearing how mean they were being to themselves inside their own head. And my heart leapt at wanting to help them with that. But if I was honest, I didn't really feel like I had traveled those depths myself in terms of being that mean to myself inside my own head, saying to myself, I hate myself, really intense negative self-talk like that. And I started looking for a way to help people with that went beyond my own area of expertise. I felt out of my depth in that particular way. There's certain ways that, of course, I've gone as deep as it's possible to go into some areas of intensity, right, with addiction. And, my food addiction is so wicked. And that's why I can really sit in the fire with people struggling with their food addiction, because I just get that to the ends of the earth and back. But as I started looking for ways to help people with this self-compassion piece, like how do you help someone develop self-compassion who just is really like knowing that they need to be nicer to themselves inside their own head, but they don't know how to get there. Lyndon Morris Del Rio, who's here on this webinar today, she's in the audience with y'all. Hey, Lyndon. She was working with Everett and doing parts work with him. Everett's a certified parts work therapist, IFS, internal family systems therapist, which we sometimes colloquially call parts work. And I'm going to talk all about that today. So if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. We're going to get there. But she said, Susan, you really need to meet Everett. And I did a few sessions with him myself, and he helped me get unstuck with some important things that I was grappling with. In particular, I was being tortured by, should I go back to my 12-step program for food addiction or just use bright line eating for my support? And I kept kind of waffling the first several years there, 2-3 years. I waffled back and forth and back and forth. And Everett did some amazing work with me that helped me get clarity about what the motivations on both sides were, and really what the part of me was that wanted to retreat back to my 12-step program. And it was beautiful work. Maybe I'll talk about that later. But I started referring people to Everett over and over and over again. And his practice just started becoming bright lifers, like just mushroomed into this practice of bright lifers. And maybe a year ago now, he left me a voice message and he said, Susan, I've been working on this. I'm calling it the BLE parts map. And I've been really seeing that the parts of people that result in people getting stuck, it's really a finite, very predictable cast of characters. And I've been mapping it out, and I'm so excited about it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need to see this, and I need to share this with my people. The bright line eating parts map, the parts of us, like the part that gets afraid of the sexual attention that we might get, the part of us that gets stuck at a certain weight and has a hard time going below that, the part of us that keeps going back and back and back to the food, even though we know it's not serving us anymore, but we keep reaching for the food. There are these predictable psychological sort of hitches that we keep getting stuck at, and Everett started to map it out, and it became very predictable. So he shared it with me, and that started a period of time of us resolving to bring this work to the tribe so that the community could experience the magic of not just what that parts map looks like, but how do you use that to really get unstuck in any of these areas. And so Everett and I started working together, and we rolled out this course called Bright Line Freedom last year in July. And it's just been amazing. We're offering the course again now, and it's so fun to partner together. And in this webinar, I'm going to share the entire arc of the science of like starting with the problem of self-compassion and going into how does this parts perspective solve that problem, all the way into Everett presenting for you today the Bright Line Eating Parts Map. So Everett, what's it been like working with our Bright Line Eating tribe, and what's it been like for you because you do Bright Line Eating?
Yeah, I mean, probably the biggest blessing for me in all this has been my own loss of 50 pounds, right? Like my own loss of weight that I had been struggling with. And I've known parts work for years, have been working with it, but it wasn't enough. It was not enough. I needed the container and the structure of Bright Line Eating to really be successful at that. And so I feel like, part of my insight is just from working with other people, but part of it also is just also from being someone who's also struggled with that myself. And there really is this magic that happens when you bring Bright Line Eating and the huge amount of support and the structure, and then you combine that with a really powerful tool like internal family systems and parts work, which allows you to really get under the surface and do the emotional work that a lot of us need to do who've had issues with food. And it's been the most exciting thing I've ever done in my life, what we're doing together. And because it's like watching on Facebook, the success stories that roll in day after day after day in Bright Line Eating, and being literally a part of that. Like this work for a lot of people is for a lot of people that struggle with Bright Line Eating, this Bright Line Freedom is actually the missing piece for them.
Yeah.
We get that feedback over and over again.
Yeah.
So it's just, and I love presenting this material. I love introducing this material to people because for many people, it's life-changing.
Yeah, it really is. And someone wrote, nice, Everett also follows Bright Line Eating and has lost 50 pounds. And you do, like, you're a Bright Lifer, you're in the Gideon games, like you actually do this for real, for real, for real.
Because it works.
Yeah.
Because I have to.
Where are you on the susceptibility scale, Everett?
I'm a 7.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a 7, and you did that vlog on 7.
Mm-hmm.
You just described me exactly in that vlog. Like not so high that I can't, kind of play around the edges and like without going off the rails, but then that really screws with me. You just described the whole dynamic perfectly.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not a crystal vaser, and my own journey has been, very rocky, and I'm not a perfectionist and don't actually want to be a perfectionist. And but my program is definitely good enough, and have gotten the results that I want from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sue Edwards keeps commenting that you sound a little echoey. Yeah, he's just in a cavernous room, Sue. So there's nothing we're going to be able to do about that. But hopefully you're like me and you can hear him through the echo. Yeah. People are now typing in where they are on the susceptibility scale. Yeah.
Cool.
Totally. So how about we dive in, everybody? How does that sound? I'm going to present some science on self-compassion. We're going to start there. And then you'll see the arc of it, and it's going to flow just perfectly right into the BLE parts map. So I'm going to go ahead and mute the chat thread. I always do that when I present science, just because the research shows that if you're multitasking, like your eyes are popping back and forth from the chat thread to the PowerPoint and so forth, it kills the enjoyment. It's not just that you don't internalize and learn it as well, but it also kills the enjoyment of the experience. And I want us all to enjoy this next little stretch of time together. So yeah, settle in. This is going to be fun to share. So I am going to take my webcam off, and y'all should see me now. I'm going to keep my phone, just my team sometimes will tell me You've gone black. Nobody can see you. So I've learned I have to keep my phone next to me just so I can see any 911 messages coming from my phone. But okay, here we are, the science of self-compassion. So we're going to start with a bit of a history lesson. Because philosophers, religious leaders, self-help gurus, and psychologists thought and wrote about the idea of self-compassion for millennia, literally millennia. But many people don't realize that up until recently, no one had ever studied self-compassion scientifically until 2003. Kristin Neff, who is the world's leading expert on self-compassion, published the first papers on self-compassion in 2003. And in those papers, she defined self-compassion. I'll be sharing the definition with you shortly because it's super important and helpful to keep in mind. She created a scale to measure it. And more recently, she's even put a quiz online where you can measure how high you are in self-compassion. I encourage you, jot this down. Go to selfcompassion.org. There's a hyphen in there and take the quiz. Not right this second. Stay with me right now, but jot it on a sticky note and circle back to it at some point. Pardon me, taking a sip of water. And then, oh my goodness, what happened then was scholarly research on self-compassion exploded. And it is still growing at an exponential rate. Let me give you an idea of what I mean. Since 2003, over 1,000 scientific articles and books have been published on self-compassion, and over half of those since 2015. So from those numbers, you can get a sense of the mushrooming. Now, Kristin Neff's book, Self-Compassion, The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself, is very interesting and helpful. I recommend it. And I also think it's got some limitations, which I'm going to be talking about here in a second. But in the book, she defines self-compassion and she says, look, the core of self-compassion really has three parts to it. Part one is what you might think of as self-compassion. It's showing kindness to oneself. But not just, when we're feeling great, but in particular, being kind to ourselves in our own minds, talking kindly to ourselves when we're experiencing suffering, when we're going through a tough time, after a failure, after not behaving the way we'd like, after letting ourselves down, when we're emotionally distraught, like when we really feel like we've blown it, can we be kind to ourselves? That's the first component of self-compassion. So essentially, inside our own heads, not this, but this, to ourselves. Part two of self-compassion is framing one's experience of imperfection, like not being perfect, in light of the shared human experience. So saying things like, everyone blows it. Everyone blows it sometimes. Everybody struggles. Everybody falls short. And remembering that larger shared human experience. Now, the opposite of that, what we're often pulled toward when we feel like we've blown it is to isolate ourselves. So in particular, if our food goes off the rails, we tend to pull away from support and try to get it back together on our own and then reconnect with support after we're back on track feeling good again. Self-compassion would lead us to the opposite, would lead us to remembering that, lots of people, everyone in Bright Line Eating struggles with their food, either before Bright Line Eating or after, or both. Everyone has had that experience. We're not alone. And that people are more than happy to be with us and support us through it. In addition to isolation, one of the tendencies when we're kind of down and not feeling great about ourselves is to compare ourselves to others, to think, oh, look at that person. Good grief. They lost 45 pounds in the boot camp. And, here I am, losing 4 pounds in the boot camp. And, they're doing it better. Their experience is the shiny, sparkly, perfect one. And I'm just, a less good example of this Bright Line Eating thing, or of life in general, right? But if we bring ourselves back to the reality of the huge range of experiences of everybody on Earth, that's part 2 of self-compassion. I'm not alone. Everyone goes through this. Part 3 of self-compassion is mindful awareness of negative thoughts and emotions. Mindful awareness. In other words, facing reality. The idea of this third component, and this one was the hardest one for me to wrap my head around, like, what does this mean? But the idea is, if you're not really there, how can you rally support for yourself? If you're not actually capable of squaring your shoulders to the moment in the fullness of its reality, you can't practice as good of coping strategies, right? So Kristen Neff put it this way: we need to see things as they are, no more, no less, in order to respond to our current situation in the most compassionate and therefore most effective manner. So mindful awareness of the present moment, facing reality as it is, so that we can cope and adopt strategies and help ourselves be nice to ourselves. So I invite you to kind of consider that first component of self-compassion, kindness to oneself, and think about how you behave when you have a close friend who feels bad about themselves and is really struggling in some way. What do you typically do? How do you respond? What do you say? What kind of tone do you use to speak to him or her? Let's imagine that they feel like they really blew it at work, that they were supposed to give a presentation and they just feel like they blew it. They feel like they kind of bumbled their words, and they realize they didn't prepare as much as maybe they should have. And, some folks asked some questions and they didn't feel like they had the right answers or good enough answers. Imagine how you would respond to a friend who was beating themselves up about that. Can you think about how you would talk to them and what you would say? Now think about yourself. When you feel bad about yourself or you're struggling, let's imagine yourself in that same kind of situation. How do you typically respond to yourself? What do you do? What do you say? And what's the tone in which you talk to yourself inside your own head? Imagining you've blown it in maybe that same way or an analogous way. Did you notice a difference? If you did, you're not alone at all. A lot of people notice a difference, and that little thought exercise can reveal sort of the magnitude of the self-compassion gap that you might have. If there's a huge, huge difference in the way you would console a friend if they feel like they dropped the ball, and the way you would talk to yourself when you deem that you've dropped the ball, that difference right there is indicative of the opportunity for growth, because what that means is that you have a huge opportunity ahead of you. Now, you're here on this webinar for a reason, I believe, right? You made a lot of choices to be here. The email about this webinar went out to some, 200,000 people. And maybe 10% of them, or maybe 20%, opened the email at all. And then some percentage clicked on the link. Some percentage put in their email address to register for it. And then some percentage of those actually arranged their day to be here. If you're here, I'm guessing the odds are you've got a huge opportunity, because the benefits of self-compassion are enormous, enormous. Let's talk about those benefits a little bit. The first one is emotional resilience. People who have high self-compassion, who manage to talk to themselves kindly and keep in mind all those other things about, shared human struggles and all that sort of stuff, they're emotionally resilient. They're able to pull themselves through emotionally difficult situations and right the ship pretty quickly. So emotional resilience is being able to adapt well to stressful situations, rolling with the punches, having grace under fire, emotional stability. And this right here is amazing. Research shows that self-compassion alone accounts for 1/3 to 1/2 of our anxiety and depression. Meaning, lack of self-compassion alone predicts 1/3 to 1/2 of our levels of anxiety and depression. Unreal. Just to give you a baseline for comparison, our genetics, like, what we got from our mom and our dad and our family, right? Genetically accounts for 1/2 of our intelligence. That's how strong a 1/2 correlation is in the literature. So to say that our levels of self-compassion, high or low, predict 1/3 to 1/2 of our levels of anxiety and depression, that's a very, very whoppingly, enormously strong effect. Which means, again, if you're lacking in self-compassion, if you're noticing that, wow, my self-talk isn't really as kind as it could be, and you have any anxiety or depression on board, it means, again, that the opportunity is enormous. The opportunity to help, to grow, to fix it a little bit, to like develop some, more helpful coping strategies and ways of talking to yourself. It will have a huge impact. Okay, second benefit of self-compassion is emotional intelligence. So you've heard of IQ. Well, EQ, it turns out, is more predictive even of someone's career success and relationship success, their likelihood of staying married, all kinds of stuff like that. So emotional intelligence is a benefit of self-compassion, and personal growth is a benefit of self-compassion. All the things involved with personal growth. And the idea there is that self-compassion fosters clarity, for one thing, about the things in oneself that might need changing. Like here, if there's a part of you that can recognize, wow, I could really stand to have a little more self-compassion, that right there is some self-compassion popping up in you, like saying, hey, I'm open for this growth. I can see that I could benefit in this way. If we're low in self-compassion, it doesn't mean that we're devoid of it. It doesn't mean we have zero, right? So if there's any part of you that can have clarity about needing a little bit more of that, that's self-compassion right there. You're already on the right path. And then if you've got the willingness to admit it, even better. That's self-compassion there too, right? Like, hey, yeah, I could do better with that. It's interesting. It can be very hard to change, like in the personal growth kind of way. And there's research on men who are emotionally and physically abusive to their spouses and their families. And nothing seemed to help these men, like classes on anger management, support groups, educating them about the consequences, when you blah, blah, blah. But you know what did help? Self-compassion training. When the men tapped into their need for self-compassion for themselves, they stopped being so abusive. Isn't that fascinating? Question. How is self-compassion different from self-esteem? Because in the 1970s and 1980s, the literature on self-esteem exploded, and self-esteem was touted as the panacea for just about everything. All these studies came out in psychology showing that kids who have high self-esteem do better in school and go on to grow up to get better jobs and are less likely to get pregnant as teenagers and less likely to do drugs, and on and on and on and on and on. And researchers started to say, wow, we need kids with higher self-esteem. So in the 1980s, this movement of just praising kids to raise their self-esteem, letting them know how good they were, the whole idea of like everybody gets a participation trophy, right? We're going to have a tournament or some kind of mock Olympic games, but everybody gets a ribbon, right? Because God forbid anyone's self-esteem gets, trod through the mud, right? We need to keep everyone's self-esteem really high. And then in the 90s and 2000s, all this literature was published showing the backfire of that what we got from sort of indiscriminately praising our kids was kids with very high self-esteem and very low performance. Like kids in America, for example, compared with kids around the world, kids in America have the highest math self-esteem and the lowest math performance. And the countries with the highest math performance, like South Korea and Singapore and so forth, those countries have the highest math performance, but the lowest math self-esteem. And so all these results kept coming in showing, hey, self-esteem isn't as universally great as we used to think. So Kristen Neff did this research comparing self-compassion to self-esteem. It's really interesting what she found. So we've already defined self-compassion. Let's go ahead and define self-esteem. Self-esteem is an evaluation of our worthiness, like basically believing that we are good, valuable people. You could think of self-esteem as having two components, believing that we're capable and believing that we're worthy. A little different, right? But those two things make up self-esteem, believing that we're capable and believing that we're worthy. You can have one without the other, by the way. A lot of people feel capable but not worthy, and there are people who feel worthy but not capable. And that can be domain specific as well. Like you can feel capable, capable of playing soccer well but not capable of cooking well, whatever. Capable actually breaks down by domain. Okay. And worthy does too, by the way. You can feel worthy of good relationships, but not worthy of making good money and that kind of thing. So Kristen Neff and her colleagues have tested the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion in dozens of studies. And here's what they find. There are a lot of similarities. So both self-esteem and self-compassion in general, across the board, are associated with less anxiety, less depression, more happiness, optimism, and positive emotions. But when things go wrong or our egos are threatened, if we feel like we didn't do something right, if we feel like people are looking at us, if we feel like, maybe we blew it, at that point, self-compassion has a clear advantage. When the chips are down, self-esteem often deserts us, but self-compassion doesn't. So what's interesting is feelings of self-compassion don't depend on being special or above average or on meeting, some sort of internal set of ideal goals or anything like that. Essentially, in a nutshell, what the research shows is that high self-compassion has literally all of the advantages of high self-esteem and so much more, all of the things that high self-esteem is missing. Self-compassion comes in to fill those gaps. So, for example, people with high self-esteem tend to be more hostile and aggressive when their egos are threatened. They become braggarts, they become accusatory. People with high self-compassion and high self-esteem don't. Because, when their egos get threatened, they don't slip into the need to prove anything. They can be like, okay, well, maybe I'm not the smartest, best in the room. That's okay. Doesn't mean I'm any less worthy, right? Like, around the world, there's only one prettiest, and there's like how many billions of us, right? So it's okay. So now the question comes, and you might have been asking yourself this already, how can we develop self-compassion? If you identified in that little thought experiment a gap between how you talk to others and how you talk to yourself, you might be thinking already, like, okay, I could use a little more self-compassion. How can I develop it? Now, alas, this is where I said I would point out like something I think is needed or missing in the self-compassion literature, like in Kristen Neff's book. The current research on self-compassion doesn't provide the structural depth necessary to help us develop a reliable and fully mature sense of self-compassion. And that is a problem. So if you think, wow, I'm so hard on myself, I really need to change that. But I don't want anyone here to know how harshly I talk to myself. It's pretty embarrassing, actually. I can be really brutal to myself inside my own head. So I'm going to work on it on my own. And then over time, you think, I've tried to change this, but I keep failing. My inner critic is as strong as ever. What comes up is that the irony is, it becomes clear that striving for self-compassion actually produces isolation and self-criticism. Isolation and self-criticism, because you isolate yourself from others and you have yet one more thing to be self-critical about, right? Can you see it? You're now critical about the fact that you're not compassionate enough. And this becomes a downward spiral. Now, there is a way of looking at ourselves at the deepest level, like who we are, that will relieve this. And in order to talk about what I think is the ninja move, the judo move for developing self-esteem so quickly, it's really remarkable how quickly I've seen Everett produce deep, never before experienced levels of self-compassion in people in a 10-minute session. I saw this on stage at the family reunion last year. Unreal. And it comes from overcoming the mono-mind view. So I got to explain what this means. If we ask ourselves, who am I? Who am I? Most people would say something like, well, I'm me. I'm one person, one mind, one soul, one spirit, undivided with free will. We might not say that, but we believe it. We believe that there is a self that is unified in some way. This idea is so ubiquitous and naturally assumed that you probably wouldn't say it. If I said, who are you? You'd probably revert to some like social labels, right? I'm a whatever. I'm a teacher, I'm a spouse, I'm a parent, whatever, right? But deep down, you're believing that you're one person, one mind, one soul, undivided with free will. And odds are you never question whether it's true. More importantly, you never question whether it's helpful, like whether that notion serves you. Now, the trouble is, we watch ourselves, we all do, act against our own highest good, don't we? Eating things that we shouldn't be eating, drinking things we don't want to be drinking, saying things to our spouse or our kids or our parents or our, that we don't want to be saying, talking to ourselves in ways we don't want to be doing, whatever. So here's mindless eating, right? So we watch ourselves act against our own highest good all the time. And we know we have fears and harsh self-judgments and all kinds of emotions and thoughts that keep us from being who we want to be. So what do? Well, we work on it. Now, maybe we hide or ignore what we're not liking about ourselves and go into some denial. Food is really good at that, helping us numb and kind of ignore things for a bit. But more often what happens is we work on it. And in doing so, we set up a fight with ourselves, kind of like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain over and over and over again, because we're trying to discipline ourselves. And if it doesn't work, we keep trying harder and it doesn't help. We come to realize at some point we just can't control ourselves, or at least certain parts of ourselves, right? We can't control certain things that we keep doing that's not up to our standards. And this produces a certain amount of shame. In some people, quite a lot of shame, deep shame. So maybe we go to therapy to get help correcting our irrational beliefs, to process our unhelpful emotions, but we stay stuck. So maybe we learn to meditate and we grapple with our thoughts by ignoring them, transcending them, letting them simply be, not interacting with them, not exploring them, letting them float by like clouds against the sky. And so what happens? Well, maybe we're a little calmer with pockets of happiness, but odds are our problems are still there. Still eating, still judging ourselves, still feeling like we haven't found the answer. I want to say there is another way. And the purpose of this lecture is to invite you to take a second look at who you really are. I want to share with you right now an entirely different paradigm on what a person really is, a paradigm that's more useful and I want to argue more true to your lived experience. I think it's going to resonate with you. It might sound woo-woo, it might sound a little out there, but if you just sort of keep an open mind and hang in there with me, I think you'll see that it resonates. It is a minority perspective in terms of the history of psychological thought, but I'm going to show you the history and you'll see that it's a consistent, strong minority perspective. And I'm not going to mince words. The paradigm in a nutshell, I'm going to tell you right up front, is that the self is not one, but many. That's it. That's the perspective right there. The perspective is that we have parts. We have parts. And our parts are consistently interacting with each other inside of us. And that's what we call thinking, right? That constant interaction of our parts. Our parts are using their emotions and impulses to try to control our activities and behavior, like a food indulger part that tries to get us to eat something that's off our food plan, right? That tries to get us to order in a restaurant in a way that, is maybe just stretching it or maybe clearly outside the bounds, right? That's a food indulger part. Our parts are consistent. They're not transient, coming in and out of existence and being replaced by new parts. We've got a steady, sort of family living inside of us. They're multidimensional. So unlike if you've seen the Disney movie Inside Out, it's this movie about the emotions that live inside of a little girl. And there's sadness and there's joy and there's anger. And those parts are very unidimensional. Like sadness is just sad always. Joy is just happy always. But our parts are multidimensional, more like actual people that have, different aspects to them. Our parts are hugely powerful to affect our actions and feelings, even to get us to do stuff like to eat stuff or whatever. But what's important to note is that they're powerful to transform and develop valuable qualities that benefit us. When we engage and work with our parts, in dialogue with our parts become stronger and more resilient in ways that benefit us. Our parts so for example, my food indulger part, now that I know more about my food indulger part, what my food indulger part can do now is get me to rest. It used to do that by just offering food as honey, you need a load off. Why don't we make this day, ease up this day a little bit by eating something. But now that I am in more dialogue with my food indulger part, what my food indulger part now can suggest is you need to carve out some more time to rest, to take care of yourself. So our parts can transform and develop positive, valuable qualities that benefit us. So Richard Schwartz, who I'm going to talk about in a second a little bit more, said it this way. If you consider your inner parts to be residents of the mind with full range personalities, as well as abundant intelligence, autonomy, and power, and if you think they contain many valuable qualities and resources, and that they reflect the natural state of the mind, you'll listen to them with genuine curiosity and respect and relate to them in a compassionate, loving way. So Richard Schwartz wrote this book, Many Minds, One Self, which is the source of the history lesson that I'm actually going to present right now, which is the history of this parts perspective, which I find really fascinating. The parts perspective goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. We're talking 4,000 years ago. The first written record of the many minds concept was found in this ancient Egyptian text, where this man was arguing with his ba, or his soul. And basically, the man wanted to kill himself, and the soul was like, no, that's not a good idea. And the man was like, but I really, really want to. And the soul was like, no, I don't think you should do that. And the man was like, then the man tried to like barter or like, offer, like, well, how about I promise that we'll be buried with like lots of good stuff. We'll have a really good tomb with, anyway, so the man and his soul argued for a long time. It's a little ambiguous at the end of the text what happens, like, does the man kill himself or not? But the point at the end of it is the man and his soul find peace. It says something like, the soul says something like, we have now had a good talk and we can now live harmoniously. So maybe he doesn't kill himself. Fast forward to Socrates 2,400 years ago, around thereabouts. Socrates was a huge believer in the many minds concept. And as a matter of fact, I think he came up with just the pithiest. Socrates was so incisive, right, to say the least. He totally believed that the mind was multiple. And here's his argument. It's so straightforward. He said, look, one mind cannot both want and not want at the same time. Right? But we do all the time. And he said, therefore, the mind must be at least dual. QED, right? There you go. I mean, there's no getting around that. And how much does a food addict understand that, right? Wanting and not wanting at the same time, right? There's at least two of us inside there, the one that wants and the one that doesn't want that. Yeah. Now, if we move forward again a little bit in time, Plato was a big believer in parts. He had several sort of metaphors for the parts inside of people, but one of them is from the dialogue Phaedrus, where he basically likened a human being to two horses. One horse is white and upright and honorable, and the other is black, dark, crooked, insolent, impulsive. And there's all kinds of art depicting the two-horse concept of a human being from Phaedrus. If we go to the Bible, the Old and New Testaments, which shaped Western thought for centuries, obviously, biblical stories commonly depict people at war with themselves, a battle between their different inner parts. And there's some great quotes from the Bible that illustrate this perfectly. So these two wills within me, one old, one new, one servant of the flesh, the other of the spirit, were in conflict, and between them they tore my soul apart. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Classic, right? So many of us can relate. Then if we fast forward into the 1500s during the Spanish Inquisition, this was a time when the mono-mind view really predominated. And during that time, any signs of a multiple inner life were seen as evidence for demonic possession. And if you couldn't prove that you were getting messages from God, you were assumed to be possessed by demons. Any parts that were, trying to get you to do negative stuff or whatever, that meant you were possessed by demons, and that meant that you could be killed. So you had to really hide any evidence of inner conflict that could be different parts. Now, Saint Teresa, just after that, who's often depicted in artwork with light and a dove flying above her head, Saint Teresa of Avila proposed a third option, which is that signs of a multiple inner world might not be messages from God nor demonic possession, but were perhaps a medical condition, like an illness. And thus was born the medicalization or the pathologizing of inner parts. And that tradition stretches right into the present day. It started with the designation of multiple personality disorder, which is a disorder from older versions of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's the United States Psychiatric Classification Handbook of Mental Disorders. And the unitary view of the self, through the medicalization of the idea of parts, became the widespread default view. With that idea, and maybe you can identify, maybe you've been feeling uncomfortable, like as I talk about these different parts, you're like, you're making me sound crazy, like that's not mentally sound, right? But that is a notion that's been spread by this historical turn of events where the idea of parts became pathologized. And the media really picked up on this pathologizing of inner parts with multiple personality disorder and put out a bunch of really influential movies, all kind of in the same couple decades. So the movie Lizzie in 1957, the movie The Three Faces of Eve in 1957. Also, Joanne Woodward won Best Actress, the Academy Award for her role in this movie. And then Sybil with Sally Field in 1976, also with Joanne Woodward, interestingly, an older Joanne Woodward. But these movies had a huge impact on just the layperson's, the popularized view of parts as being really the sign that someone was, I'll just use a crass term here, but really crazy, really crazy. Now, it makes sense in some way that a parts perspective would get deeply pathologized because patients with strong active parts nearly always report having been severely abused. And the parts create really deviant and distressing symptoms. At that point, they tend not to be sort of passive. They're really wreaking havoc in someone's life. And so the assumption that a psychiatrist, for an example, could come to is that a healthy mind is unitary and a deeply troubled mind is split into these parts. And there's a pathological condition afoot if someone has, really strong parts. Now, multiple personality disorder was renamed dissociative identity disorder in the DSM-4 in 1994. So now it's called dissociative identity disorder, but it's the same thing. It's got the same essential criteria as multiple personality disorder. Now, here's the thing. Here's the truth. Trauma doesn't create parts inside of us. No, that's not how it works. What happens is that trauma makes the parts we already have more extreme, more separate from each other or different from each other, more polarized, and therefore more noticeable. And probably also more problematic, like, really creating a lot of behavioral symptoms and abnormalities. But we all have parts. I mean, Socrates' point is just undeniable. One mind cannot both want and not want at the same time. Therefore, you've at least got two parts inside you, the part that wants that cake and the part that doesn't, right? So from a parts perspective, the healthy mind is multiple, but the parts are more harmonious. And therefore, the inner parts don't stand out as much, and they can literally go unnoticed. Most people blend with their parts. They don't even realize, for me, for example, When I'm in my highest self, I'm protecting my bright lines, I'm prepping my food in advance, I'm making support phone calls. And then when my stress ratchets up, my support phone calls fall off, my food prep, sort of falls apart. And before I know it, my food indulger has come in, suggesting that I go out to eat tonight and maybe order, a much oilier, sexier meal than I would normally have. And I often don't even realize that I've now blended with my food indulger, who's coming in, trying to ease the stress, trying to suggest an easier, softer way to end the day, right? By going out to dinner. But my food indulger, when it's like that, it's not that different from my highest self. And I can completely not notice that I've just blended with my food indulger, and that part is now dominating my thinking as I try to figure out what to do for dinner tonight. Does that make sense? So I don't have, dissociative identity disorder, but I definitely, have a part inside me that feels very strongly about protecting my bright lines. And then a part inside me that really wants to go take her comfort in a big, yummy restaurant meal, right? Two different parts. And Albert Einstein pointed out something brilliant, as always. Whether you can observe the thing or not depends on the theory you use. It's the theory which decides what can be observed. So, whether I can even observe what's going on inside me as I debate with myself about what kind of dinner to have, right, depends on the theory that I'm using. And what I'm telling you is that the parts theory really helps. It really helps to be aware of the typical approaches of the food indulger as you start to look at, well, when do I go off the rails with my bright lines, or when do I become wonkier with my habits, my healthy habits, or whatever, right? So what's happened is, from the Renaissance until the modern day, the mind's multiplicity has been discovered, lost, discovered, lost, discovered, and lost again. Over and over and over and over again. So a theorist is more likely to discover it if they have a mind open enough to consider the possibility at all. Because remember, the mono-mind view has dominated since the 1500s. It's been the most, I'm going to share with you a little bit more of the modern history, but, it in this day and age, it takes a certain kind of theorist to really embrace the notion of parts. They have to have an open mind. They have to have an ability to become purely curious, and the belief that there might be benefit in asking questions of what might manifest as emotions or thoughts or sensations. That probing right there is when you really start to get into the juice of the parts. Like, wow, that's a really fruitful endeavor. But then they have to have something else, which is the courage to speak or write about it in the face of probable skepticism or ridicule. I'll point out through the modern history lesson, certain theorists didn't have that. They never were willing to go public with their beliefs really strongly. So different theorists have possessed different amounts of those three qualities, which accounts for much of the differences among modern day theories. So let's move into the modern age now and talk about the 1800s. Friedrich Nietzsche, I wish I spoke German. I could pronounce his name better. But he said, the more individuals one has in oneself, the greater the prospect will be of one's discerning a truth. Which is such an interesting thing to say, right? It's basically saying that wisdom and discernment and insight are directly correlated to the number of parts we have inside of us, or perhaps the parts that we're aware of, right? And then we get to the late 1800s and up till 1910. These couple decades were interesting because various multiple models of personality dominated in both Europe and in America. So, for example, William James in America, most people consider him to be the founder of modern psychology. He was a huge parts proponent. Pierre Genet in France, also a big parts proponent. Max Dessoir in Germany, same. Frederick W.H. Myers in the UK. And now we get to Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud, of course, had the id, the ego, and the superego, which appears like a multiple theory, right? It sure does. It smacks of it. But they were not personalities. And Freud did not have the curiosity to inquire of them. He never engaged in any productive way with the id, the ego, and the superego. He kind of just relegated them to the unconscious mind, and just allocated all kinds of pathology to them without ever getting curious about what they thought or felt about things, without questioning them, without fleshing them out at all. So they just remained in his theory, sort of dead, two-dimensional, unconscious drives that never actually got much play. They were very flat descriptions of the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, Carl Jung, a contemporary of Freud's, absolutely believed in multiplicity. He said the so-called unity of consciousness is an illusion. We like to think we are one, but we are not, most decidedly not. And he wrote about the collective unconscious and archetypes and so forth. Carl Jung, one might say, never really took a stand for parts. He believed in them, he wrote about them, but what he did was he kind of gave them obscuring names like the collective unconscious and archetypes and so forth. And whether I don't know, because I'm not inside his head, never have been. I'm not one to judge, but one might surmise that he just didn't have the guts to bring to the field such a bold claim that, look, we've got these parts and here they are and here's how they work and so forth. So he stopped short of really diving deep into parts work in that way. But he certainly believed in it, and he knew that the mind was not single. Now, we get to the 1960s, and Fritz Perls, a German psychoanalyst, developed a technique that became hugely productive. He developed the empty chair technique. And what he would do in therapy sessions with people is he would get an empty chair and put it in the room. So the therapist and the client and this empty chair would all be sitting there. And he would, when the client was getting emotional about something, let's say they were really angry, he would say, okay, I want you to put your anger in this chair. Can you put it in the chair? Put your anger in the chair. And then he would look to the chair and he would say, tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what you think about this. And he would make the anger talk. He got very curious about people's emotions. And through this method of personifying the emotions and giving them a voice, people said things and experienced things that completely surprised both the clients and the practitioners. And it was hugely productive. And this brings us to the inner child movement, which happened not long after in the United States, which was a huge step forward in our understanding of parts. Between 1962 and 1980, all kinds of developments happened around the notion of a wounded inner child, which is a phrase that you've probably heard before. We've all heard it. There was a book called Your Inner Child of the Past. The 12-step program ACOA, Adult Children of Alcoholics, was born, and ACOA in its literature talks a lot about our inner children and healing them. And John Bradshaw published several New York Times best-selling books on inner parts, and particularly the wounded inner child. And what's great about the idea of an inner child is that this is a widely relatable construct, right? Almost anyone can tune into the idea of a wounded inner child part. I mean, I can tell you about my wounded inner child. My biggest childhood wound is probably around being socially rejected as a kid. I was super rejected in grade school. I didn't have a lot of friends at all. I was teased mercilessly. I ate lunch alone. playing basketball with headphones on in the gym. I didn't have play dates. I wasn't invited to birthday parties, that kind of thing. And it was painful, right? And so even though it's funny now today, right, I'm in a position in my life where I'm not isolated or ostracized. As a matter of fact, I have all this sort of, people send me cards and letters and gifts and, say they love me and say they're my fangirl. It's really weird, right? But I have this wounded inner child that still kind of doesn't believe it and is still kind of stunned that people want to play with me and hang out with me and be my friend at all. So, I don't know what your wounded inner child experienced or where that pain is in you, but all of us can relate to it, right? We all have maybe more than one wounded inner child, right? And I want to point out a couple things. First of all, a wounded inner child is a full subpersonality, meaning it's multidimensional. It has needs, it has a voice, and has the potential for healing. The potential for growth, right? So it's not unidimensional. It's not just an emotion. It's an entire part of us that was hurt in some way, but, there's a lot going on in there. Now, interestingly, if you go around the world, which has been done, and look at indigenous cultures, there still are many cultures that live separate from mainstream, internet access, smartphones, et cetera, right? And if you go to those communities and you ask them about the soul, about the self, many of them will say, well, there's two. We all have two souls, two selves. The Fijians will say that, the Algonkins and the Karens. The Chuchi and the Yukagir and the Ashanti and the Dahomey will say that there's three souls or selves inside each of us. The Dakotas will say 4, and the Malays will say 7. But clearly, the notion of a parts perspective, that we're not unitary inside of ourselves, that we have different parts that feel different ways, that experience the world in different ways. It's a very, I don't want to say universal because that means it appears everywhere, but I will say the evidence is clear that it's very widespread, and the notion will pop up independently among communities who have never had any contact with any other culture that has a parts perspective. It seems to keep springing up. So Socrates' observation that one mind cannot both want and not want at the same time, therefore we must all be at least two, that truism has dawned on people all over the world at different times and places independently. Now, the birth of modern parts work started with a guy named Richard Schwartz, who I've already introduced you to. I showed you the cover of one of his books. I gave you a quote of his. And in the early 1980s, Richard Schwartz was a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He was doing psychology as a professor there. He was a family systems therapist. So if you don't know what family systems therapy is, it's the therapy that says, look, everybody comes from a family of origin of some kind, and families have systems, right? So maybe there's multiple kids in the family, and one of them is the peacekeeper, and one of them's the scapegoat, and one of them is the rebel. You get the idea, right? The parents sometimes play good cop, bad cop, or whatever. And fair enough, families can be non-traditional and different compositions, but still, even if it's just a single parent and one kid, like I had, I had a mom and a dad, but they were divorced. So I was only one kid with a single parent at any given time. There are roles, right? There are roles. And Richard Schwartz was doing work with bulimics using his family systems approach. And he was working with the bulimics and their families, learning about their family systems dynamics, and, trying to use awareness of the family of origin dynamics to help the bulimics binge and purge less. And he and his colleagues conducted a study after a while. How effective was this work with bulimics and their families, using family systems and so forth? And, they measured binge episodes and purge episodes over time, and they found out that it was not doing anything. It wasn't helping at all. It's completely ineffective. And they've been working with these bulimics so intensely, they were kind of blown away by this. Like, really? It's not helping at all? So Dick Schwartz could hardly believe it. So he called the bulimics into his office one at a time, doing sessions, and he just got really curious. Like, tell me about your binging. Why are you still binging? Like, you understand so much now about your family of origin and how your role in your family. Tell me about this binging. And he talked with them to try to sort out why. And they talked back, and he listened. And they began talking about different parts inside of them. These parts that fought with each other, that protected each other. And to Dick Schwartz's ears, it sounded like a family system. Like, basically, they were saying, look, I have this inner critic. I feel like I fell short here. I blew it there. But this inner critic was battling with a binge part. I've got this part that wants to binge. It wants to eat everything and everything, just obliviate myself with food. And then I've got an inner critic that's like, don't do that. You're going to gain weight. You always do that. You're fat and you're, da, 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 da. And then upon closer scrutiny, the binge part actually was trying to protect a vulnerable part. There was like a wounded inner child in there that was so hurt. And the binging was the solution to, sort of protecting that vulnerable one. Oh my goodness. So once Dick Schwartz addressed these parts, they had a lot to say. Like, they just kept talking and talking and talking. And the parts really wanted to tell their stories and what they thought and felt about things. But after a while, they were talked out, and then they relaxed. And then what happened? This is the miracle right here. This is the amazing part. Then what happened was the essence of the client would emerge in that relaxing. He called it the self. The calm, confident, capable, curious, self-compassionate self. You could call it highest self, authentic self. I tend to call it highest self. Everett tends to call it authentic self. We're always talking about the self, which is not a part. It's us. And from this work, internal family systems, or IFS, was born. So the family systems is really with the actual families, the moms, the dads, the kids, the brothers, the sisters, etc. The internal family systems is the system of parts inside of us, inside of a human being, that combines to produce the outcomes and the experiences that we have, right? So internal family systems recognizes that the self is an aspect of the mind that can be accessed and developed into a leader. The self is like the parent we always wish we had. The self can reparent the parts in a certain way. The self brings balance to the parts. And the parts come to trust the self and want her to be in charge. The parts are really relieved when the self gets stronger. And IFS is the most mature of the parts perspectives. There are other parts perspectives, some. IFS is very established. It's certifying therapists and coaches around the world. And it's right up there with cognitive behavioral therapy in being extremely evidence-based. So running clinical trials, publishing papers, and so forth. Very, very research grounded. So that wraps up our history lesson. I want to share a couple more things with you just to sort of hammer home the notion of parts from other perspectives, because of course I'm a neuroscientist, right? well, cognitive scientist, really. Neuroscience is a part of cognitive science. My PhD is in brain and cognitive sciences. So I'm really curious about what neuroscience has to say about the parts perspective. Like, we've been studying the brain now for a long time. We don't know everything about it by a far cry. As a matter of fact, we know relatively little of all there is to know about the brain, but we know some stuff, and certainly enough to look into the brain and say, okay, so when people are active, living their lives and having their emotions and whatever, does it look inside the brain like they're a unified one self, or does it look like there are parts? Are we one mind or many minds? And yeah, research that would bear on this question goes as far back as 1959, when split brain research was happening. Split brain research is this freaky little sort of blip in the history of neuroscience, where for a time, just that span of years, they don't do the surgery anymore, when someone had intractable epilepsy, like grand mal seizures all the time, to the point of dysfunction, like the person couldn't even live a life because they were just having epileptic seizures so often. What they knew about the brain, which was not much back then, was they knew that these epileptic seizures spread through the brain. And to try to stop the spreading of the seizures, they would cut the brain in half, right down the middle through the corpus callosum, which is the bundle of nerves that connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. They would just sever it, leaving the person with two brains rattling around in one skull, essentially. Split brain. And what happened when they split the brain was they learned some stuff from these patients. There's just, a couple dozen patients over those, 8 years. The first thing they learned was that the left hemisphere is happy and the right hemisphere is depressive. And yeah, this has been confirmed with EEG and MRI findings, but the left prefrontal cortex is the seat of our positive emotionality, and the right prefrontal cortex is the seat of our suicidal ideation, negative emotionality, depression, and so forth. You can even see it in babies, like in the first few months. Difficult babies, colicky babies, huge amount of right prefrontal cortex activity. Content, happy babies, sleeping and eating on a schedule. Strong dominant activation in the left prefrontal cortex. Michael Gazzaniga, probably the most famous and influential neuroscientist of all time, did a lot of that split brain research, has moved on in his career, done amazing things. I got to speak with him not long ago after a talk he gave at the University of Rochester. And I got to ask him, one mind or many minds? And he said, many minds, many minds. He helped discover the left hemisphere interpreter, which is the part of the brain that is always spinning stories about what's happening to help it all make sense. He said, we've moved toward the idea of a plethora of systems. We no longer think of the brain as being organized into two conscious systems at all, but into multiple dynamic mental systems. In other words, not just two parts, many, many, many parts. And, systems is, he's not a psychologist, right? So he doesn't talk about parts. This isn't from the psychology. He's talking about the brain. He's talking about systems of neurons. And it's consciousness. That's what his work was on, is how do the neurons produce consciousness? And he said it's way more than two conscious systems, multiple conscious systems. And so that's interesting. Now, if you go to an entirely other domain, into artificial intelligence, you ask, well, if you're going to build an intelligent system, do you build it as one mind or many minds? And from the words of Marvin Minsky, the co-founder of MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab, a single program can't mimic any form of intelligence. If you try to build an artificially intelligent computer program with one program, you can't do it. No intelligence emerges from that. What's needed are many minds, many specialized agents for different jobs. You have to build it in parts. When we join these agents in societies and we take the parts and put them together, right? In certain very special ways, this leads to intelligence. Isn't that fascinating? So from the neuroscientific perspective, the artificial intelligence perspective, and the psychological perspective, and the philosophical perspective, I mean, I think Socrates' point, one mind cannot both want and not want at the same time. That's really philosophy, right? When he says that. Now, this isn't news to us. Anyone who struggles with food or their eating knows clearly that there's at least two inside of them, right? The part that wants to order the red wine and the dessert at the restaurant, and the part that's like this guy with his hand on his hips here, right? Going, no, you're not doing that, right? Clearly, at least two parts in all of us when we go out to dinner. Now, maybe we're working our program so strong that we're in highest self and all these parts are quiet. We go out, we order the right thing, we have a really peaceful meal. But almost all of us can relate to a time, at least, when the food indulger here on the left and the food controller on the right have been active, right? So this isn't news to us. What I want to tell you about, though, and tie all this together now, is that the parts paradigm serves you. That's the point. Because the path to genuine self-compassion is living in your highest self. Why? Because the highest self naturally feels compassion for all the inner parts. There's something about, for example, let's imagine someone who binged last night, right? From a monomind perspective, someone who does bright line eating and binge last night could feel really terrible about themselves and feel like they let themselves down. And they always do this. They're hopeless. They're never going to get it together. What's wrong with them? When you're in one mind about it all, the loop of self-recrimination and shame is really hard to get out of. When you take a parts perspective and you say, okay, yesterday was really stressful. And so I had this food indulger part that came in and really wanted to ease my experience of the day, wanted to offer, like a little kid offering a cookie, like, mommy, it's okay, have a cookie, right? I had this part that was trying to make the day a little bit more comfortable. Not an adaptive strategy for sure, but understandable. Very understandable that that part was trying to help by saying, why don't you eat about it? And then the eating a little led to eating a lot because the oblivionator came in and just wanted to numb out completely. When you put it in terms of parts, it's so easy to feel compassion like you would for someone else. That same way that when someone else blows it and, does something that's understandable, but not maybe the best approach, you can feel so much compassion for them instantly, effortlessly. And the highest self has that same ability to feel instant, effortless, overflowing compassion for the parts. And they're precious, wayward little ways. They're doing their best to help. They're always trying to be helpful, even though their strategies are sometimes not super helpful, right? But they're trying to be helpful. So when we come to the present day of internal family systems and parts work, we now have someone on the forefront of parts work. Everett Considine is internal family systems certified. He is a bright lifer. He does bright line eating. This is the two of us at the second annual family reunion. So that was like roughly 2 years ago. He's been working with our community since 2015, working, with hundreds of us now since 2015, logging thousands of hours of helping people with their parts. And he has put together this comprehensive bright line eating parts map. And I know that each time I hear it, I identify more and more with the specific parts that I have. You won't have all of them. You'll have some subset of them. So I invite you now to listen as Everett explains the bright line eating parts map, the BLE parts map. Thank you, everyone. I'm just looking at the numbers of people in the room, and it's amazing how many are right here, like lockstep. Thank you so much all for hanging in there.
Okay, I have to do my little. How's my
Your
audio
little-
sound?
Yeah, your audio sounds great.
Okay.
You have to do your little trick to get your slides come up.
Yeah. So I'm going to do that. There we go. How's that look?
It looks like it doesn't look good. It looks like it's going back and back and back and back and back and back. It looks like a.
Okay, how about that? Still the same?
Are you screen sharing?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, still the same.
Okay, so let's try it again.
Okay. It looks like when I was a little kid and I had
mirrors, right?
mirrors. Yeah, you'd pull in the mirrors and look down the into the forever. Yeah.
Oh, this is the difference. Okay. So now. Okay. How's that?
There we go.
Okay.
That's it. Yay. All right.
All
Let's hear about
Here's the BLE parts map. Wow, and I learn so much every time I hear that presentation, Susan. It's amazing to hear the history behind all this. So, so the BLE parts map, right? Like I call this the cast of characters that are living inside each of us, and specifically each of us that are doing bright line eating. And I'm just going to touch on them quickly right now, and then I will go in depth to each one. And we always lead with authentic self and highest self, because the good news about your highest self, the good news about self-compassion is you don't have to develop it. You don't have to go learn how to become self-compassionate, because self-compassion is naturally present when you're in your authentic self. And that's why this particular model is so connected to the benefits of self-compassion. Your inner critic, which is also a key player in you not feeling self-compassion. And when I first started to work with BLE people, this is the part that just stood out so much, and was how harsh many of our inner critics are. The isolator, this is a part that kind of came on the scene a little bit later for me after I'd been doing lots of work with people. And the isolators are also a real key character in getting us past what makes our programs challenging. And then the food controller, which Susan's been talking about, and the food controller is the part of you that's trying to control your eating. And then the food indulger. And the food indulger is the part of you that when you do want to eat off plan and you want to indulge, that's your food indulger. And then the wounded child. And we're not only wounded when we're children, we're also wounded later in life. But I kind of use the wounded child as sort of a catch-all to talk about our woundedness. So this is the BLE parts map, right? It's pretty simple. Right, it's pretty simple. And as I go through and describe each part in more detail, just notice how these parts live in you. Notice the things that ring for you, and maybe notice the things that don't ring. Again, the good news about authentic self is that is who we are at our core. Our authentic self, our highest self. And in this work, we use C words to describe when we're in our authentic self. And so when you feel calmness, that's a sign that you're in your authentic self. When you feel confidence, that's a sign that you're in your authentic self. When you feel curiosity, that's a sign you're in your authentic self. When you feel creativity, when you feel clarity, when you feel courage, when you feel compassion, when you feel connectedness. And I invite you to just reflect for a moment. How alive are these qualities in your life? Many of us that can connect with authentic self when we're out in nature, when we're, uh, you know, connecting with loving friends and family, when we participate maybe in a spiritual practice or a religion that really brings us a lot of peace, meditation, prayer. Uh, the the two sides to doing parts work is, yes, we work on our parts, but there's a big focus on how do we live more and more from our authentic self. And so we can bring these qualities to our parts. And you might notice that one or more of these qualities is not everyone feels calm, but maybe you don't have a lot of calmness, but you have a lot of curiosity, right? Maybe you have a lot of compassion, but you don't have a lot of courage, right? Like there may be certain qualities of your authentic self that you're more naturally in tune with. And so part of the work I do with people is to help people live more and more from their authentic self. You might think of authentic self as kind of being that flow state, when you're just in that place when everything feels good and everything's moving and you're not triggered. And then the question is, if we're all authentic self at our core, well, what happens when we're not feeling these qualities? Oh, well, what's happened is our parts have gotten activated, either from our thinking or from the environment. And the kind of parts that get activated on the BLE journey are one of the first ones. The story of the isolator was people call me who are having challenges with their BLE program. And many times the people that were having the most challenges, right, like who could not get through even a few days with bright lines, had a lot of desire to do the program, but the follow through wasn't there. I would just ask them, what is your support like? What is your support like? Do you have a buddy? Do you have a mastermind group? Do you commit your food to anyone? And almost universally, people that were really struggling a lot would say, like, oh no, oh no, I don't have a buddy. Like, no, I don't. I'm not a group person, or oh no, I can't do that Facebook thing. It's too complicated. Or, I don't know. I don't really get along with people. And what I would do in that session is I would just work with them and really work with the part of them that was keeping them isolated, the part of them that was keeping them from reaching out for support. And once we did a little bit of work with their isolator so that they could then start to reach out for support, oh, well, then their program would click into place, right? Because now they were utilizing all of Brightline Eating, which is the tremendous support network. So the isolator protects you by isolating you from other people and the world, and it works with the indulger in various ways. And again, just notice, do you have a strong isolator? It helps avoid shame by keeping your addiction secret, right? It keeps you from reaching out for support so the indulger can function without shame. It helps you remain invisible by keeping you overweight. It keeps you from creating accountability so your actions remain unseen. And it whispers in your ear that you don't belong and that others are judging you. And it tells you that others cannot be trusted and you are only safe alone. One of the things I found in the BLE community is a lot of us have really strong isolators. And they keep us from reaching out for the support that would really make all the difference. And you might even find your isolator is talking to you right now about this course or about this presentation. Um, just notice it's a really powerful part to get to know. And one of the things that we know in this work is that all these parts are protective parts that are trying to help us. So your isolator just really believes that if it can keep you away from people or the world, you'll feel better. And usually that's because of wounded parts that we have, right, that actually get activated by interacting with people in the world. So the isolator, like in Bright Line Freedom, the isolator is the first part that we really do a deep dive into, right? Because I'm really want to encourage people to reach out. So if you have trouble reaching out, or you reach out tentatively, or when you reach out, it doesn't kind of go well and you pull back and stop reaching out, you might have a strong isolator. And there's a little bit of a difference between just introversion, right, which some of us are introverted and we need to be alone. I'm kind of on the border, on the ambivert, right, but I recharge by myself. And so it can be a little tricky sometimes noticing whether you're just being in your healthy introversion, or whether you have an isolator that's trying to protect you. And one of the ways you can tell is just noticing, is your isolation working for you? Is your isolation working for you? If your isolator is keeping you from reaching out for the support and bright line eating that would actually make the difference, well, that's not healthy introversion, right? Like there's something else going on there. But in parts work, you would actually get to know your isolator, and you would get to know really what's going on there. And that's what we teach in this work, is how you can really actually get to know your unique parts. The food controller, right? The food controller. Um, our food controllers love bright line eating, right? Because it's controlled. It's like there's a plan. And some people's food controllers just like, boy, they find bright line eating and they set up their food prep schedules, and pretty soon they're just controlling their food and they're so happy. And then some of us have. I did a talk called the Shame Game, where I talked about different types of some of the different. Oh, well, I'm going to show you some of the food controllers. Let me just do that. So some of our food controllers are just rational, right? And many of us know everything about food and diet now, right? Like we have tried it all, we have done it all. We can analyze the pros and the cons of anything. And obviously, that wasn't enough, right? Like that's where bright line eating came in. Like there was something deeper. But many of us have a very rational food controller that really kind of knows everything. Some of us have, food controllers that are like, encouraging coaches, right? And if you have a food controller like that, oh, that's a happy thing, right? That's a happy thing. Um, Many of us have perfectionistic food controllers, and that you must do everything perfectly, and a lot of times where there's perfectionism, there's shaming, right? Like there's a sense of disappointment when you're not perfect. And so many times, if we have a perfectionistic food controller, the food controllers are happy when you're doing things right. But soon as you're not doing things perfectly, or your indulger starts to come onto the scene, they can turn into really harsh, shaming voices. Those of us that have struggled with bulimia or purging, right, might have a food controller that just wants to get the food out of your body, right? Like that's a food controller. Some food controllers are harshly critical, and punishing even. And one of the things that in this work you really will unpack, like in the first month when we're really going through the BLE parts map in detail, you're going to really learn about how your food controller and your indulger war. And if you have a harshly critical food controller, it might be, whenever your food indulger is active, it might be shaming you so much that it actually fuels the indulger. So your food controller starts to actually fuel your binges. And many times, those of us that struggle with binging, that's what's happening. You know, something happens in your environment, and your indulger comes online, and then once you start to indulge and you start to eat, your food controller gets so mad, and it's so harshly shaming that it makes you feel so bad that you're forced to eat more. And then the more you eat, the more your food controller shames you, and we get caught in these shame spirals. We get caught in these shame spirals. And again, that's like really, without a parts perspective, like that's really difficult to deal with, right? What do you do? And that's one of the reasons that so many of the ways that we've worked with our food issues in the past really haven't worked, right? And but soon as you start to see that there are two parts there that are kind of in a war, oh my God, it just makes total sense, and that you can unblend from them, and you can bring in your authentic self as the loving parent, to deal with those two parts. Suddenly, this thing that was so complicated to deal with really isn't so complicated to deal with. And that's a lot of what the parts perspective brings. It makes things that used to seem really complex, ways of getting stuck that were really complex, pretty easy to deal with. Pretty easy to deal with. Sometimes we have a food controller that is just going through the motions. There's no joy. I call it the robot, right? And it might actually be allowing you to be successful at losing weight, but it's not your authentic self. There's not a sense of the fact that you're nourishing yourself and you're taking care of yourself. It's just going through the motions. And then the indulger, right? Each of us have an indulger, right? And the thing that's so key to learn, and it's the science that Susan brings forward that's so powerful around the addiction that many of us have to sugar and flour, right? Like that when we can get those substances out of our diet, then the physical craving for them will stop. Right. And we all know that feeling of like when our bright lines have been clean for a while and those cravings stop. Right. And then so there's like the physical aspect of the addiction, right? And then there's the parts aspect, which is something challenging happens in your life, or you have a high level of stress, or something happens that triggers a wound. And then this part of you that has always used food to just numb the pain, to distract, to entertain you, comes up and says, hey, I know you're feeling terrible right now. Let's have something. You deserve a treat. Or, I'll talk about the different kinds of indulgers, right? But this is, now we're looking at, there's an emotional component in addition to the physical. You've got to get that stuff out of your system, right? Or you'll just continually crave it, right? If you're high in the susceptibility scale. But even once you've gotten it out of your system, your stress and emotions can now trigger the parts of you that are used to feeding you. When you're feeling bad, right? And the indulger is the part of you that wants to indulge in eating off plan, right? And it's very interesting to, when you have breaks or you're having cravings, or to really simply notice how you're feeling. To simply notice how you're feeling. And because when the indulger comes in, it comes in so fast that many times it blocks the feeling before you even notice it. So just in the past, right, we would just have food in our mouth, right? And we would not even notice that we just had a feeling, or that something rough just happened. And so one of the things that happens in parts work as you get to know your indulger, as you start to build a healthy relationship with it, you will notice when the indulger suddenly starts doing what your indulger does, you're like, oh, wait a minute, the indulger is here, right? What am I feeling? Right. And then you check in and you're like, oh, I'm feeling lonely. I need some company. Right. Or I'm feeling angry. I can't believe that person just did that thing or just said that thing. And by turning your attention to your feelings, right, which is the other thing we learn how to do in this work, you can disarm the indulger in that moment. Or at least you can have a conversation. Or once you start to heal your indulger, you can have the experience like Susan is having now, where the indulger isn't coming with food anymore, but it's just coming to say, hey, you need some rest. You need some rest. So here are some of the indulger archetypes. The loving mother, the loving parent, right? You deserve this treat. And I have found this over and over with people that have strong caretaking parts or live a life of service, right, where they're taking care of people during the day and they're not really taking care of themselves, right? So they're getting burnt out and stressed out. As soon as they get home and they've had their meal, there's the loving mother. You deserve this, right? You deserve this. And just to try and make you feel better. The impulsive child, right? Boy, many of us know that, right? Like the whole candy industry is built on the impulsive child now, right? Like every checkout stand is just piled sky high with candy within reaching distance of the person standing there, right? If you have an impulsive child, that's an indulger that just says, I want it now. I just want it, right? And the seductive rationalizer, right? The seductive rationalizer is, for many of us, it's the first whispers of the indulger that start to like, oh, it won't really make any difference. Oh, it's just a vegetable. That doesn't have any calories, right? And it starts to rationalize your breaks. It starts to rationalize your indulging. And many times it kind of sounds like ourself, right? Until you get hip and start to notice, like, oh, it's the beginning of the slippery slope. And then the oblivionator, right? The binger, and that's the part. Typically, if when the oblivionator is up, it's because there are feelings. They're really big feelings that are being eaten over. But the thing that again ties into that, if you have a harsh inner critic or you have a harsh food controller, soon as you start binging, right, that food controller goes into high alert, and if it's punishing, it starts really shaming you, right? What's wrong with you? Why can't you control yourself? You're blah, 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 blah. And each of those messages creates more and more shame for your wounded child. And then because there's more and more shame, the oblivionator wants you to eat more and more. And so one of the things we say in Bright Line Freedom and that you learn is to don't shame, get curious. Don't shame, get curious. If you can notice when you start to shame yourself and switch away from shaming to just being curious to what you're feeling or what just happened, because something did. You just had a feeling. You just had some emotion. You just had some stress happen. And if you can get curious about it, you can really stop a shame spiral before it starts. And then the rebel, right? BLE, when it's being done perfectly, is something to rebel against, right? Like, wow. And many of us have rebels that will rebel against anything that feels controlled or controlling, right? And many times people are really frustrated because they see the benefit they'll have from bright line eating. But when it gets down to doing it, they won't do it. There's anger about it, and that's the rebel. And so what you do in parts work is you get to know your indulger, right? You get to know your indulger. You can journal about it. You can dialogue with it. And through getting to know your indulger, you'll be able to make different decisions when your indulger gets activated. The inner critic, right? The inner critic. This is the opposite of self-compassion, right? This is the opposite of self-compassion. And many of us are just overrun with inner critics. And some of them are really harsh and really stand out in high relief when you start to do your inner critic work. And then some of them are very subtle. And then some of them don't even have a voice. They just make us feel like there's something wrong with us without even telling us what it is. And doing inner critic work is one of the key ways that we wake up self-compassion. And again, by working with your inner critic, by developing a relationship with it, by getting to know it, and then ultimately even finding out how it's trying to help you, because it is, you can actually heal your inner critic. You can actually transform your inner critic into an inner mentor, into a voice that can be encouraging rather than harsh and shaming. And one of the top inner critics is the perfectionist. Many of us have perfectionist inner critics that want us to be perfect and, want us to look perfect, want us to sound perfect, want us to have the perfect relationship, want us to, for our house to be perfectly clean. And when we're not perfect, it shames us about it. And guess what? Perfection is an ideal. It's not even actually possible most of the time. So people that have perfectionistic inner critics usually feel very imperfect. And it's kind of shocking sometimes because you'll see someone with a perfectionistic inner critic whose life looks perfect, right? Like, because this part just pushes them to do everything perfectly. And then you might even go like, wow, it's so amazing. And you start to get to know their inner world and you find out they don't feel perfect at all. They don't feel perfect at all because they can never actually measure up to that perfectionism. Our inner controllers, right? Like a part that's trying to control things inside of you or control things outside of you, is also a kind of critic. Our food controller is a great example of a controlling part that can then turn into a harsh inner critic, when it's not getting its way. A guilt tripper is another kind of inner critic, and that will guilt trip you, make you feel guilty about things in the past, make you feel guilty. That's one of, just in doing my own work, I really discovered that I have a really strong guilt tripper critic. And those of us that kind of land in that caretaking, pleasing, conflict avoiding personality type, many times there's a guilt tripper kind of driving a lot of that behavior. And so it's really, I've done sessions with people where I've simply helped them get to know their guilt tripping inner critic and allowed them to release lifelong guilts, like things that they've been for years and years and years that they've been feeling guilty about. We've done work with their guilt tripping inner critic and they were able to see what's going on, and that part was able to change its role, and they were able to have relief from things that just they felt for years and years and years. A taskmaster is another kind of inner critic, that part of you that pushes, that wants you to be working, that wants you to be productive. Many of us that have a strong taskmaster also have a strong procrastinator, or a part that tries to come up and go against the taskmaster. And if you have a strong taskmaster part, you may find that it's hard to rest, or that it's hard to enjoy your rest, right? And many times our inner critic is kind of a little mixture. Like, you may see multiple inner critic types that resonate for you. The underminer, right? Like, that's a critic that just basically is trying to keep you from doing things by telling you that you're not good enough, right? It's like a mother strategy that doesn't want their child to ever fail at anything. So they're constantly telling them, like, oh no, honey, no, you really can't do that. You need to focus on something that's easier, right? And she's just trying to keep the person from ever feeling like a failure, and really undermining any sense of excitement that they could have in their life. The conformist, right? We can have an inner critic that is trying to mold us, right? Some of us have a conformist that we're supposed to be a good girl, right? And then if we do something that doesn't conform to that good girl image, our inner critic rips us apart, right? Many of us feel like we need to be successful at a certain level, right? Or have a certain sort of image in the world, or be a certain way, and we can have a conform. And many times our conformist critics are really formed by the culture or the family that we're in, right? Our family lets us know in no uncertain terms who it is we need to be and what we need to be like. And if we deviate from that, this inner critic really comes down on us hard. And the destroyer, some of us have a critic that comes up sometime that doesn't want us to exist. And so it gives us messages about not existing. And destroyer critics are really, really rough and harsh. And the interesting thing is, many people can't really imagine that a destroyer critic has a positive intent. But when you get in there and you get to know it, what you'll find is that critic, at some point in your life, that critic thought it was safer for you to not be than to be. Right. And so it created this strategy of just always telling you that you shouldn't be. And so these are the critics, right? And as you can see in the inner critic world alone, and when I first started working with BLE people, it was a lot of inner critic work, right? And if you've not done your inner critic work yet, you can see that this is a really rich area. And all these inner critics are blocking your self-compassion, right? They're creating the opposite of self-compassion. So when you get to know your inner critic, when you heal your inner critic, and you start to unblend from your inner critic, then those benefits of self-compassion start to arise. Those benefits of self-compassion start to arise. And then there's the wounded child, right? And we've all been wounded in so many ways, right? And some of us had outright abuse. We had people hitting us or sexually abusing us. Some of us were neglected. We had a kind of abuse that kind of is invisible, right? Because we didn't get what we needed. We didn't get what we needed, and it had an impact. So all of us have a history, and all of us have, I really believe that we're we're designed to be wounded, right? Like, the way the system of life works, it's impossible to not be wounded as a child. And what really grows out of many of our wounds are is our character, is our strengths, are like very positive things can come out of our woundedness. And then hopefully what happens later in life is, once our self is here, our adult self is here, then we go in and do the work to heal those wounds. And this is one of those tools that can help heal the wounds from the past. And I'm just going to touch into some of the different kinds of wounds. And, I get feedback sometimes after this presentation from people that say every single one of those things happened to me. Right. And so I want you, just as I touch into these, just be really gentle with yourself, and just be very loving with yourself. And this is one of those places when Susan was talking about self-compassion, where we can see that we're not alone, right? Like that we're all wounded, right? Like I'm going to touch on these wounds, but so many other people have these wounds. There's an attack wound, right? I was yelled at, hit, or exposed to violence, and now I'm afraid of people's anger. A judgment wound. I was judged harshly and frequently, and now I feel inadequate and bad about myself. The shame wound. I was publicly ridiculed and embarrassed, and now I feel ashamed of myself. The violation wound. I was intruded on, smothered, or abused. Manipulation wounds. Domination wound. I was dominated and controlled, and now I allow people to control me, or I'm afraid of that happening again. Exploitation wound. I was used to meet my parents' needs. Betrayal wound. I trusted a caregiver and then was betrayed by them, and now I have a hard time trusting anyone. Guilt wound. I was repeatedly made to feel guilty about things I did, and now I can't forgive myself. Rejection wound. When I reached out for connection, I was dismissed, and now I don't expect people to like me or want me. This was the wound that Susan mentioned that she had. Need wound. I wasn't adequately nurtured and cared for, and now I feel empty and needy. Abandonment wound. After being taken care of for a while, I was abandoned, and now I'm afraid of being left again. Not seen wound. I was not seen and appreciated for who I am. Deficiency wounds, the basic deficiency wound. Because of what happened to me, I feel that I am fundamentally flawed. This is one of those wounds that I find that we all have. All of us have an inner child part that at some point in our childhood formed a belief that it was fundamentally flawed. Unlovable wound. Because of what happened to me, I believe that I am not lovable. And what we do in Bright Line Freedom, what we do in this work is, many of us have wounded inner children that get activated by the things in the environment, right? Or get activated by our thinking. And in the past, that was when our indulger would come in to like numb out those feelings. And the good news is that you can heal these wounds, right? And that's what this work allows you to do, is actually heal these wounds. And as you heal your woundedness, and on two levels, right? As you heal your wounds and as you bring more support into your life and you start to de-stress your life, what happens is your indulger really starts to relax. Your indulger, you might have a perfect program, right? But because your life is still so high stress, and you have wounds maybe from the past that are still activated, your controller is still keeping your indulger under control, right? So that's that feeling of white knuckling sometimes we have in bright line eating, right? And you can have, and thank God, right, that it's able to do that. I mean, you can definitely take the weight off and have success with that. But there's not fulfillment in that, right? And what happens as you do your healing work and you start to work on reducing the stress in your life, then what happens is you start to do your BLE program from your authentic self. right? When your indulger isn't being activated anymore, then your food controller doesn't have to be on high alert. So your food controller relaxes also, and then you start to move into that beautiful automaticity that Susan talks about. And so one of the goals of this work is to help you move your bright line eating program from primarily being controlled by your food controller to being run by your authentic self. And then that's where you start to bring ease into your BLE journey. So so that is the BLE parts map. And just notice where you see yourself, and the thing I really want to tell you is that healing is possible. Healing is possible. And just like maybe you didn't have success with diet programs before Bright Line Eating, so you kind of formed a belief that like, oh, well, I'll never be able to take the weight off. The thing I can say about what we're doing in Bright Line Freedom is that this is an approach that really demonstratively is showing now that healing is possible. And this is how we apply it to our food journey. So I'm going to turn this back over to Susan now.
All right, I am here. Let's see here. I am going to share my screen. Thank you, Everett. Just it's funny how you and I geek out on our like the presentations we each give, because I think that was like my 4th or 5th time seeing the BLE parts map, and I get so much out of it each time. And you say the same thing about my science of self-compassion thing. So it's just really cute. We're like, every time. I love seeing it. I get new ahas every time. Okay. So, I want to start off here by talking about Dana Oliver for a second. Dana is a sweet, sweet person in my world. She's one of my strongest Bright Line Eating supporters. She's a Bright Lifer. And she started Bright Line Eating in February of 2016. So over 3 years ago. She actually just hit 3 years at maintenance recently. And she was in a right-sized body pretty quickly, in a few months. And after about 1 year at maintenance, her food went off the rails. Happens to a lot of people. And she then spent a year eating sugar every day, and every day promising herself that this would be a bright day, and finding herself eating sugar by 11 a.m. And the hopelessness and the desperation and the demoralization of that were just profound. And she started working with Everett one-on-one in the midst of that, partially for her food, but also there was stuff going on in her marriage she wanted to address, having to do with kind of feeling like she needed to move from California to New York. And there was a bunch of stuff in there that was in the mix. She didn't get the real relief, though, until she signed up for Bright Line Freedom. And what happened in the course, Bright Line Freedom, this was in July last year that she signed up for Bright Line Freedom. And she got her bright lines back right away. And in July of 2000, she's basically had 10 months now of squeaky clean bright lines, just happy, thin, and free since then. And what happened was in Bright Line Freedom, in the course that Everett teaches, she was shown how to do parts work with herself, which, when she did one-on-one sessions with Everett, he was kind of doing it for her in a way, right? Like taking her through the session. But in the course, she learned how to take herself through the work. And that's when the magic happened for her. She got her lines bright. Yeah. And she's been happy, thin, and free since then. And she talks about how her system doesn't suggest anymore that she eat over emotions. What happens is her system suggests that she slow down, that she check in with herself, and that she feel the parts that are active and give them what they need, which she says usually is a hug or usually some kind of emotional sustenance. And the need or the desire to eat off plan just isn't there anymore. So it's beautiful, beautiful, beautiful to witness that in her. You know, the other person that I know, well, I know so many people who've done parts work with Everett, but I think of Lyndon, who introduced me to Everett. Now, I don't know if you know, Lyndon's never had a break in her bright lines. She was in the first boot camp in October of 2014. And she got her bright lines from day one and got into a right-sized body within 6 months, lost all her excess weight. And she's been living happy, thin, and free now. She's celebrating, what would it be? 4 years on maintenance. Yeah, amazing. So Everett and I have an invitation for you because Brightline Freedom is being offered again. And the course starts on Monday, like in 2 days. And Brightline Freedom is an amazing course. I'm going to take you through it. I'm going to invite you to enroll. And then we're going to do some Q&A. So that's how the last bit of this webinar is going to go. So truly the purpose of Brightline Freedom, the course, is to help you find and live from your authentic self, your highest, most authentic self. And along the way, to get freedom from all the things that, you know, may be tripping you up, especially around keeping your bright lines. It follows an internal family systems approach, a parts work approach, like we just described on this webinar. And it goes through the bright line eating parts map in detail, related to you, like which of these parts are active for you. Now, at the beginning of Brightline Freedom, the picture of my face is like in the corner there, and I've got, look at these, like the certain time of day where the light, just like in this picture, funny enough, the light comes through. It's so funny. I've got these weird lights on my face. You see that? So funny. Does that work? Nope, that's worse. Okay, let me just try to step aside here. Okay. It's so funny. The light is like mirroring the light in this slide. And the light in the slide is meant to capture the notion of spiritual feeling. So if you have a spiritual path or a religious path, or you don't, the beginning of the course is going to help you dive into your value core. And there's nothing in it that is going to be in conflict with anything that you might already believe or, you know, feel allied to in your core. As a matter of fact, the Brightline Freedom course has the approach of strengthening your core inner beliefs already and using that value core as a source of strength as you find your authentic self, learn to live from it, and then learn to navigate the parts that pull you out of self. So I just wanted to say that there's nothing in the course that is contradictory to anything that you might already believe or any work that you might already have done. It's only complementary. In the course Brightline Freedom, you will learn how to release shame, guilt, anxiety, burdens from the past, wounds from the past, and discover and heal hidden emotions and buried core issues. It's just a reality of this work that people's buried core issues tend to come out in doing this work this way, in a good way, like in a helpful way. I know that might sound scary, but no, in a super good way. Pardon me as I futz with the light a little bit more. There we go. Okay. Now, what you learn to do in parts work is to unblend from your parts. So remember how earlier I was describing how I used to like feel stressed out and then just go out to eat, and I wouldn't even notice my food indulger coming in and sort of whispering in my ear that seductive rationalizer that I might want to go eat. you learn how to unblend from your parts. And it's very helpful. And what emerges as you unblend from your parts is self-compassion, just a huge amount of self-compassion for the part of you that might be needing it. Those parts need self-compassion, and they deserve self-compassion. They're just trying to help. I want to remind you what we talked about earlier. The benefits of self-compassion are freedom from depression, freedom from anxiety, increased. Now, I can't promise that if you have depression or anxiety, from a clinical perspective, that this will heal it. But I can remind you of the research, which shows that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of that depression and anxiety is tied to or predicted by lower levels of self-compassion. And as we, release your natural ability to have self-compassion for your parts, the research shows that that would predict that your depression and anxiety are likely to go down. And like we said, increased emotional resilience, increased emotional intelligence, and dramatically accelerated personal growth. So those are the benefits of self-compassion. That's why to do this work. The course offers a clear, comprehensive roadmap for doing the work and a wonderful mix of methods. So a mix of methods that works for introverts, for extroverts, for people who like to journal, for people who prefer to talk on the phone with people, and for mastermind groups and buddies, for people who prefer to do it solitary, and so forth. So there's so much that's available in different modalities, so you can pick what really works for you. The course involves trainings and coaching calls and witnessed parts work sessions, which are sessions where someone is experiencing parts work with Everett and you listen in. You might be able to be one of the people who does the parts work with Everett, or you could be a witness to it. And it's, we often find that just by witnessing it, you get almost the same benefit, especially if you resonate with the types of parts that they're getting worked on. So those are super helpful. Guided parts meditations, lessons and exercises, and online support community, readings, and there's some more advanced readings as well. Like if you gobble up what's available and you want additional resources, Everett provides a lot of additional resources. Now the work can be done with buddies, mastermind groups. Everett's going to be doing a lot of work to improve community and increase community connectiveness through the course. But it's also important for you to know that if you want to kind of do it in a self-therapy way, that works. So if your isolator is really up right now and you're like, I don't want to be, doing parts work sessions with other people, that's fine. And you really can do the course in a way that works for you. We genuinely want you to listen to your authentic self and do the course in a way that works for you. So there are two ways to do this work. There's materials through the course, and you can hire Everett to take you through it personally, which is a $12,000 package. Or you can enroll in Brightline Freedom, which starts on Monday, which is not $12,000, it's $997. And Dana's experience was she got more value out of the course Brightline Freedom because of the heightened tools to do the work on herself. If you want to do payments, you can do 3 payments of $367. And if you're a Bright Lifer, you want to go to the Bright Lifers website because you get a discount. You get a $100 discount on the course, so it's $897 for you, or 3 payments of $327. You don't want to enroll here on this webinar. You want to go to your Bright Lifers website, lifers.brightlineeating.com, and there's a banner right up top on the home screen that says Enroll in Brightline Freedom. The course starts right away this Monday, May 13th, and it's a 15-week course. So that is exactly the length of a full semester college course. It's very in-depth, a 15-week course. Everything is recorded, so you can do it at your own pace. If you're going to be away for a couple weeks or on a vacation or holiday, that's fine. Everything is recorded, so people go through the materials at their own pace. When the course ends after 15 weeks, you'll get access to everything for 6 more months after that. So you could literally go through the course 3 times in a row. So I want to invite you to go ahead and register. Let me make it possible for you to register. How would you register? It's not even there. Okay, so now on the side of your screen, you should see Brightline Freedom, Living Your Authentic Self. Register now. Yeah, go ahead and register now. Again, if you're a Bright Lifer, don't use this link here in this webinar. Go to the Bright Lifers website so you can get your discount, please. Okay. I want to emphasize there's a 100% money back guarantee for 30 days. So 30 days from the day you register, you can have your money back for any reason. So you can absolutely sign up for this course, kick the tires, see if it's working for you. And you have 30 days to say, nope, wasn't a good fit, I'm out. So there is no risk. So we really invite you to join us. This course proves to be the linchpin for people in our community. It is so transformative. The feedback we get on this course is amazing. And we all know that when we put down the food, so much life shows up, right? It becomes really quite a thing to learn how to navigate everything that we used to eat over without turning to food. And this is the pathway through all that. So, Brightline Freedom. I'm going to go ahead and invite Everett back here. And you know what else I'm going to do is I'm going to enable the chat thread because we're going to move now into Q&A. I'm going to see if I can keep these funny. See if I can increase the light a little bit without having funny lines and polka dots of light. Hey, Everett, how are you?
Hello, I'm good.
Good. All right. So we're open for questions on any of it. You know me. You can ask me anything. Everett's the same way. We're open books.
True.
Right? And yeah. So go ahead and ask any questions. If you could do us a favor and mark your question as a question. The way you do that is you type it into the chat box and then you hover your mouse over it, and there's a way to mark it as a question, like the big red question mark. That would be helpful. That would be helpful. We'll try to catch all your questions, even if you don't mark them. But the chat box, I believe, is now active. Yep, the chat is active. And if you have any questions, I'm looking in the Rita Smith says, looks and sounds wonderful, but even with the Lifers discount, this is just way out of my reach. Sad face. Yeah, Rita, we understand finances are in the mix for people, and that's something that everybody's going to need to take a look at for themselves, right? I find for myself, there have been stretches of time in my recovery journey where money was really tight. Like I made $16,000 a year for 6 years as a graduate student. And that's not a lot of money to live on, $16,000 a year. And the times that I prioritize, like I remember going to an international recovery conference, which cost way more money than I felt like I had at the time. And I still remember that as one of the turning points in my life. I felt the call and I made it happen. And I'm not saying that that's what you should do here. I don't know that at all. But I do know that if someone is feeling called to this course, there's a way that money is a spiritual thing. Like when you commit to needing something, the finances can rearrange themselves to be possible. I saw this with Molly Larkin, who's a dear friend of mine. Some of you know her, and she decided she felt like she needed to become a certified life coach, and she invested, I forget how much it was, like a $40,000 thing. I don't remember. Whatever it was way out of her budget. And she did it anyway. She just put it on her credit card. And the things that flowed downstream from her throwing her knapsack over the wall in that way of saying, I commit this hugely to my next level of growth and beingness as someone who's, ready to take this next step. It was amazing. So yeah, like I see that one both ways. I see that, yeah, for some people, money is it's just a thing. And it's like, you know what? I can't make this happen right now. And I also see the way of, for some people in that same situation, it would be, you know what? Money is a thing and I need to make this happen right now.
Yeah, I'm someone that just has invested enormous sums in personal growth. I just have, like, because
right?
at some point, like, I got it, like, oh my God, I'm going to get so much out of this,
Yeah.
and then, usually I could piss away that amount of money pretty easily if I look at all the kind of random things I spend money on. But I believe that's part, and I've had friends like who don't do that, right? Like, Sam and I, my husband and I, are joiners. Like, we jump in, we're yes, yes, and I've seen so much positive growth and transformation in our lives. Where some of my friends who like don't do that, they don't do that. They stay with their life, and so anyway, it's good to be a yes sometimes.
Yeah.
And again, with the money back guarantee, you really can just give it a try. And if it's really not worth the investment, you really can get that money back. It's actually, I think, the ideal way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Okay. So many questions have just popped up. Edward. Okay. You're so funny. Well, Susan, should food be a struggle every day since we must eat 3 times a day? Um, not necessarily. In the same way that just because we brush and floss our teeth twice a day doesn't mean it has to be a struggle to do that twice a day. You really can get into a rhythm of automaticity where it's not a struggle. But because we have to engage with it 3 times a day, food, in my experience, is the hardest addiction to kick by far. By far. It's so much easier just to abstain from something entirely, like cigarettes or alcohol or drugs or whatever. So I don't think it means it has to be a struggle 3 times a day, but it introduces the potential for struggle more than any other drug I know of.
Well, and if you've not done that emotional work yet, right? Like, people are kind of blind to it, right? Because they've food just always comes up as what they see instead of the emotions. And it makes a big difference when you reduce that stress level. You start healing those wounds. You start transforming the reasons, the indulger. The reason it's a struggle is the indulger's still active, right? The indulger's still getting pulled up, and then your controller is like controlling the indulger, right? And you can have a successful program like that. Like, you can hold to your lines, but it feels like you're white knuckling it.
Yeah, totally.
And then that's a sign that there's underlying stress. And that's what we do in Bright Line Freedom. It's like this really in-depth understanding of what's going on in your life at that level.
Yeah, totally. And the same Edward said, thank you for bringing up the inner child work. He discovered that he was sexually abused by a caretaker at the age of 5. Everett, can you speak to that a little bit? Because I'm sure that's not an uncommon thing for people in Bright Line Freedom to be dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, what I find in general is that people in Bright Line Freedom tend to be older, right? So there's not like 20-year-olds who are just discovering they were sexually abused and doing that work. So people tend to have like done a lot of work on it, but that kind of trauma does leave a lot of reactivity in your parts, right? And so the work that we do, even if you've done a lot of work with that, like a lot of people have, you'll find a new layer of work that you'll be able to do. And some people find that IFS is kind of that final tool that they needed
Yeah.
to really get underneath something that they've been struggling with their whole life. And
Totally. Leanne has a simple question. Will you be able to access the program for 6 months after it ends, even if you aren't a Bright Lifer? Yes. Same 6 months for everybody. And Sharon wants to know, sounds awesome. I wonder if this is the best approach for stress reduction. What do you think about parts work for stress reduction, Everett?
Yeah. Again, what is stress reduction? It's living more from your authentic self, right? Like living into your calm, clear center, right? And stress is living on top of something. It's just like this feeling we have, and there's actually there's parts there. There are parts under the stress. And so as you learn how to do parts work, you'll be able to actually get under your anxiety and start to get to know really what's going on. And there may be healing you can do, or you may have parts that are bringing things into your life that are causing you stress. And so as you get to see those dynamics, right, it's like the thing I've talked about. You could have a caretaking part that doesn't know how to say no. So it fills your life up with crap that you don't want to do, right? Like if you get to know that caretaking part and unpack that and heal that and then resurrect your no, right? Suddenly you stop doing all these things you don't want to do and your stress level drops, right?
Yeah. Awo Quezon Saki. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name right. Sending love to you. Says, I already registered. I'm really looking forward to the course. This is Awo from Accra, Ghana. You have a participant from Ghana.
Wow.
So awesome.
That's
So
cool.
awesome. David says, I am just starting my boot camp after having it postponed due to some personal issues. I am really interested. However, I'm worried whether I can make the time to do this, the meditation and the boot camp, because I am swamped with work right now as well. Do you think I might be biting off more than I can chew?
Well, so a way it could work, right, is you have access to the material of both of them for a while, right? So if you wanted to, like, maybe not, you could alternate every week and do a boot camp, do some of the Brightline Freedom. You might find that there's a little phase in Brightline Freedom where you want to dive in for a while or do that with the boot camp. They're very different. The content's very different.
Very different.
So that's not going to be confusing. You'll absolutely know, well, this is boot camp stuff. This is Brightline Freedom stuff. So I would, be honest with yourself. Would you do it, or is it just going to be one of those things you would end up buying and not doing? Right? You don't want to do that, right? Or will you dive in and give it a try? But again, you got 30 days, so you could try it. You could register, and if you find you're not doing it and you don't have time for it, you can just ask for a refund.
Yeah. David, my hunch is from what you wrote here, it doesn't sound wise, right? Like you said that you postponed your boot camp already because you signed up, some personal issues came up, you're swamped with work, you're already feeling stress about juggling the meditation and the boot camp and so forth. The boot camp and Brightline Freedom are both very intensive courses, and it takes a certain amount of space to process really meaty stuff like this. This isn't like a light, this isn't just a little thing. This is like a very transformative course. And so is the boot camp. So my take would be, unless you are someone, and you're not, I know I'm not, now I'm talking to everyone else, for everyone else out there, unless you're someone who has tremendous space in your life, you're retired, your kids are long gone, you've got hours every day where you have discretionary time, and you're one of these people that, like, when the assignment comes out, you've gobbled it up, you've read it, you've done the journaling like within the first day, and then you're waiting for the rest of the week for, like, what do I do with the other 6 days? Because I already did it all, right? You spend 5 hours the first day and do it. Unless you're that person, I would say don't do 2 Brightline Eating courses together, the boot camp and Brightline Freedom, or any of our other, like, our courses are full on, right? It's not that they couldn't be done 2 at a time, but only in that rare circumstance where someone just has really a lot of space to dive in. It kind of like a full-time job, right? Like I'm doing this bright line eating work kind of full-time. Kathy Lannon says, is this recorded and will it be available later? I'm assuming you mean this, not the course. The course is all, you can avail yourself of it at your own pace. Certain aspects of it happen live, like a coaching call that Everett does with the group, but and then that'll be recorded and available live. But this right here is being recorded, and there will be a replay link sent out. So you could share it with people, you can watch it later, but it all comes down on Monday when the course starts. So you only have, 36 hours or something, whatever, maybe 48 hours ish to access these materials, but you could access it later. Ray McNulty, Everett, this is for you. This is awesome. My isolator is seriously dominant. Could you talk about how you can help me to overcome this to participate more fully in Brightline Freedom?
I actually have a big focus on that in Brightline Freedom. We talk about the isolator very early on. In fact, it's the first part that I really go in depth with. And so, we're going to do the work. You'll get to know your isolator. You'll start to unblend from it. You'll start to understand some of the strategies and what's going on there. And then there'll be a lot of encouragement, and there'll be a lot of other people that are doing the same thing, because it takes courage to come out of isolation. It really does. Until you start to get that positive feedback from your environment, right? Like, oh, wow, people do like me. This is safe. This is fun. Right? But before you've done that, it really just takes courage. And so, but I'm very focused up front on people's isolators and trying to help them relax those parts so they can more fully participate in the course.
Nice. Rita, I want to circle back and speak to you a little bit, because you said no credit card here. I'm on welfare benefits. And then you said, I would if I could. Believe me, I do believe in investing in ourselves. Absolutely. Rita, I just want to say how much I love you and how much I honor your awareness of your situation and what's real and true for you. There's of course a spectrum, right? There's people for whom the finances would make this really a wrong choice or even an impossible choice, right? And then there's people, and it's a fairly sizable portion of people who could do it if they chose to, and are in the position of really needing to sort through how they spend the money that they have. Everyone's got a finite amount. And I just wanted to say, of course, sweetie, I so just validate and believe in your highest self and your assessment of your situation. And there's a lot here that we offered tonight for fun and for free. And you can watch the replay of this probably 2 or 3 times before Monday. Take notes, think it over. And there's a couple. Everett, do you want to share a book or 2 that she could get? I know.
Yeah, if you come back to the and get
right.
the replay, there'll be some downloads and some PDFs, and those actually mention some books.
Yep.
Mention some books.
Yep.
So, and you can, and I know people that got those books at the library. Actually, there's one woman, was she in my Gideon Games, who did her Brightline eating from your book in a library.
Totally.
And then that's all she needed. Was that,
We make it available for free. Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Susan said, this was so informative. I did the 2-week program, the 14-day challenge, I'm assuming you mean, but I haven't done the boot camp. Which would be the best to start with? Susan, that's a great question. And the answer is very clear and obvious. It's do the one you feel called to do. Where's your pain point right now, right? Is it I'm floundering with my food because I don't actually know the system. I never got it set up right. And I don't have a basic, maybe you cut corners kind of because you only did the 14-day challenge and you never got a foundation. Or is it, no, I know exactly how to do it. And what's going on is that there's parts that are, I've got this food controller, food indulger war going on, or I've got other blockages. You just heard this whole presentation you are the best one to tell, like, what are you called to do? Are you called to build a foundation on the Bright Line Eating basics with the boot camp, or are you called to do this work? I will tell you, which is probably implicit in your question, there's no wrong order to do those courses in. You could do the boot camp and then Brightline Freedom. You could do Brightline Freedom and then the boot camp. You'll get the most out of it if you do the one that you're called to do right now. Donna Morish says, will you be offering Brightline Freedom again in the next 6 to 12 months? I'm in the middle of relocation to a different state with a lot of moving parts. Donna, no promises. We're almost for sure not going to offer it again in 2019. We don't have it on the calendar again for a particular time. And the reason I've learned to say no promises is because I believe when I offered Brightline Mind last time, I promised that I would offer it again the next year, or I was assuming at that point that we would offer Brightline Mind. That's my positive psychology course on how to be happier. It's the science of flourishing and being happy. And I promised that I would offer that course every year. I still I intended to, but it's been 2 years and it hasn't been offered again. And it's still not on the calendar for the rest of this year. We're hoping to maybe offer it at the beginning of next year, which would make it hard to launch Brightline Freedom at the beginning of next year. These launches and these courses take a lot of work and a lot of coordination with the team. That said, I know Everett really wants to keep offering it regularly when it ends. He wants to offer it again. And I know that, we want to try to make that happen too. I just don't know. I can't imagine we're going to make that happen at the end of this year. And I don't know, it's not on the calendar for next year. So how's that for a vague
but honest answer?
How's that for a vague but honest answer?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Jean Nash had the same question. How often is this offered? I just became a Bright Lifer and I haven't gotten through the orientation videos yet. I'm afraid starting Brightline Freedom now may be overwhelming. Yeah, the thing about that, Jean, is, and I don't know if it's Jean or Jeannie, Jean, but I'll just say Jean. I apologize if I'm getting it wrong, if I'm making the wrong guess. But the thing about that is that there'll be a lot of Bright Lifers in this course. This course will be mostly Bright Lifers, plenty of people who aren't, but you'll meet a lot of Bright Lifers in this course. And this course will provide a sub-community that will make your transition to Bright Lifers easier. This is not a bad way, actually, to segue into Bright Lifers. So I wouldn't worry about that. I don't have the same concern with you as I had with David, who I'm like, whoa, I think you should just focus on the boot camp. For you, I think this course, especially since, it's not going to be offered again anytime soon, I would say don't miss the Brightline Freedom boat. If you feel called to it, the answer is deep inside you, truly. I mean, that's the whole point of this course, right? If you can access authentic self, sit inside yourself and ask yourself, am I called to do this course? Your calm, clear, curious, self-compassionate, courageous self knows. But it's not a bad move for you, given your current situation, just transitioning to Bright Lifers, to just focus on this for your first 3 months of Bright Lifers. And then you'll have friends in Bright Lifers who will help you transition as you wrap up Brightline Freedom. Edward addressed this question to me, but really it's for you, Everett. Will this program help me understand, due to my abusive past, understand why anger issues just pop up out of nowhere? Because I'm tired of my past sometimes robbing me of my happiness.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you'll get under that really fast, right? It's just an angry protector that you'll get to know. And as you build a relationship with it, that issue will start to transform in your life. Yeah.
What's the angry protector trying to protect him from? Like what's a wound?
It's a wound because it sounds like he's got some childhood trauma.
Yep.
Right. So something in his environment is triggering that trauma. Mm-hmm. And then the angry protector is like, get away from me. Someone's maybe trying to manipulate him or violate him, and his protective system is like, never again. Right. And so it comes up, it's really strong. And so you have a part now that doesn't like that protector. right? Because it's extreme. And so you have to deal with that too. Not only do you have that protector, but now you have a part that doesn't like that protector, and you might have a lot of parts that don't like them, right? So you have the strong, like fierce protector that's protecting this little boy, right, from never being violated again, right? And then you have all these protectors that don't like your fierce protector, which then just creates more conflict. And again, without the parts model, very difficult to deal with all that, right? Because that's just a mishmash. But in a parts model, it's so simple.
Yeah.
It's so straightforward. Yeah.
Totally. Ginny says, how long is the Brightline Freedom course? Like, how many hours a week would the maximum commitment be? Well, maximum commitment, of course, is you can go to additional resources and do the 24/7. But Everett, for the average person who's doing a thorough good job at the course, how many hours a week are they spending on it?
I think maybe 3 hours a week. Like, there's ways if you don't have time, right? If you're one of the people that wants the benefit, but you don't have the spaciousness, right? There's a lot of people that have the spaciousness and they just jump into it like that's all they're going to do for the next 4 months. And but the lecture, you don't even have to do the reading if you're a kind that doesn't need it, because the lectures are very complete. And so you're dealing with maybe an hour to 90-minute lecture every week that might include a half-hour guided meditation and journey. So I think 3 hours a week would be, and with the fact that you could do more, right? But and because you have also a catch-up week every fifth week is a catch-up week. If you get behind, you can save it up and do it in that week. And then some people totally don't keep up at all, which is fine, right? Because and then just do the course at their own pace, and you'll just get through it when it's done, and you'll have the online community still there. So it's been designed to try and allow people at all, adult learners at all levels, to be able to participate. And you're going to get out of it what you put into it, right? As anything.
Donna wants to know, is Everett available for individual sessions, several individual sessions, if she's not able to participate?
So yeah, I do one-on-one sessions with the Brightline Eating community. So if you go to my website, everettconsidine.com, you can see how to schedule with me.
I'll type that into the chat box.
Yeah.
EverettConsidine.com.
Yeah.
Okay, I just typed that into the chat box.
And I wanna emphasize what Dana said, because she also told me, she said, she'd been doing one-on-one work with me for 6 months before Brightline Freedom. And it was a revelation for her when she learned how to do this work herself. Because I guide you through it, and we're going to do deep work, and it's going to help. But for you to learn this tool yourself, so that you can do parts work whenever you want, you can do it when you're triggered. You can, that was one of the things she said was a big up-leveling for her. And I think people will get much more out of the course than a couple sessions with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Edward is asking, can you show a comparison of the boot camp versus this Brightline program, Brightline Freedom, so we can view the comparison and see which one is best for ourselves? I'm so sorry, Edward, I didn't prepare a graphic like that. I know what you're talking about, these tables that have, little check marks, like what does it have? And so they both have the online support community. They both have coaching calls, and they both have videos that come out with instruction, but they're really completely different courses.
It's really apples to oranges.
They're not
really.
They're not similar.
Like recorded video, yes, but the content is so different.
Yeah, the content's totally different. So the Brightline Eating Bootcamp is about how to start doing Brightline Eating, like the food part, and about the psychology around that. Like, so here you are starting day one. You've got your food plan, you've got your digital food scale, You're putting your food on the scale for the first time. You've got your food written down, what you're going to eat. And now the psychology piece is more around like, well, I want you to remember to take it one day at a time, because you probably have a voice in your head that's saying, I can't not eat pizza forever, right? So take it one day at a time. You don't have to not eat pizza forever. Just do it for today. And I walk you through, what are you thinking and feeling as you start day one with your food, and week one and week two and week three? How do you eat in restaurants? How do you handle social situations with your food? How do you travel? How do you pack your food, or can you navigate restaurants when you travel? It's very much about, and then the habits, meditation and so forth, that go along with the food system. Everett's taking you through the inner journey. Do you want to speak now? How is Brightline Freedom so different from that?
Yeah, I mean, the focus of Brightline Freedom is not even, we spend the first part talking about the BLE parts back. So food is always kind of the example that we use when we're talking about it, right? But you were learning internal family systems, like you were learning a healing modality that you can use to address any issue in your life, any stuck place in your life. So, and you will have breakthroughs around your food, because that's what a lot of people bring to Brightline Freedom. And that's what I talk a lot about, right? Because it's BLE people, but it's not a course about food. It's about healing, and learning a really powerful modality for doing that. So it's just very, very different.
Yeah. David, just circling back to an earlier conversation, David said, thank you for being so straight with me. This is why I have so much trust in Brightline Eating. It takes such integrity to tell someone that they might be buying more than they can handle. It is in my nature to overcommit to good things and decrease their individual value. Thank you, Susan. Well, David, I don't know if you've been hearing, Everett has said this a couple times now. He's used this as an example. This like overcommitting part that you have, it's why you're overwhelmed, and it's probably why you're eating. And in the future, doing Brightline Freedom to address that, this like part of you that's biting off more than you can chew, probably by not saying no to people, and like having too many irons in the fire. It's a big reason why a lot of us eat, because we just have too much on our plates, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Amy E says, sorry, I missed what you said about making it clear. This is a question. I read the BLE book a year ago, took off 75 pounds in 6 months, and since then I've really been struggling. Between my parts, I'm wondering if it would be more useful for me to do the online boot camp to get into a Facebook support group, or if I should do this course. Happily, I have some knowledge of inner empathy and parts work. This was a nice reminder. I guess I could apply my knowledge. What a concept. Yeah, Amy, I'll say exactly what I said to the previous person who asked this, but you sound more like you recognize like the struggle is between your parts. If you feel called to this course, this course will probably be really helpful. I do think you should circle back in the future and do the boot camp, though. I do think that will help.
Well, and I can say too, specifically what you're dealing with, a lot of people, Brightline Freedom is the thing they need to get over that hump.
Yeah.
Where they had the initial success, they had something that knocked them off, and they haven't been able to get back to it. And then parts work, just what this is your parts, right? Yeah. And so you just get in, you start to learn how to work with your parts, you start to get into your inner world, and then your food gets, and because you've got all the routines are already there, you know how to do BLE, you've been successful with it, it just is like a switch, it turns it back on. You've got all the success ability to do BLE already there. You don't have to develop. Someone else may have to develop that, but you don't.
Jen says, I will soon complete the boot camp. What's the cost of participation in Bright Lifers? I think right now it's $474 for a year. Bottom line, there's a lot to it, but bottom line, if you sign up immediately when your boot camp ends, $474 for the year, for a full year. Amy says, is this program available to anyone who's interested, or is it only for Bright Lifers? No, Amy, it's available to anyone. It's not just for Bright Lifers. And you can register. Just to remind people, the register now thing is right on the right side of your screen. So I encourage you to go ahead and hop into the course. It starts Monday, remember, so it is time to register. Um, Rita says, thank you, Susan. I know the universe will provide when the time is right. Thanks again. I'm a current Gideon Games team leader and VIP, so probably the timing is not right. One day I will. Please don't read this out. Sorry. Put that first next time. Edward says for Everett. So Everett, Bright Line Eaters program would best who have eating issues with an abusive past, especially physical and sexual abuse. I think he means Bright Line Freedom would be best for someone who has a past, who has eating issues and has a past with an abusive past with physical.
Well, what I can say is that, a lot of people in that scenario have done Bright Line Freedom and had good results with it. And so because it's about, again, doing your inner work and getting to know your parts and being able to do that parts work. So, yeah. So, and in more general, people that, we've all are traumatized in many different ways, right? And from our past, and we all have protective systems that have built up on top of that trauma, and for many of us, part of that protective system was food. And so that's what's been going on our whole life. And so this course is going to let you unpack that, like really see in detail how that works for you. And, and if you have, I also would recommend if someone has a lot of trauma that's getting triggered, that they have a therapist that they're working on. There's people that do Bright Line Freedom and then also are working with a therapist at the same time. I believe in a lot of support, getting a lot of support around your healing.
Susan McGinnis says, how does the payment program work? And can you join Bright Lifers after the program is over? The payment program is, it's just three monthly payments. So one today, then one exactly a month from today, and then one a month from then. That's it. So, and can you join Bright Lifers after the program is over? We actually don't have a Bright Lifers on-ramp after Bright Line Freedom. So you might want to do the boot camp afterwards if you haven't done that. Yeah, we could. I mean, if you wrote into support and said, hey, I just finished Bright Line Freedom and I want to do Bright Lifers, we would let you do it. I just did what I always do with and now my team is like, wait, what did she just promise? What do we have to? Yeah. Susan wrote something so sweet. She says, thank you, Susan. This really spoke to me. In December, I journaled, quote, there are two sides to me, maybe more. Everything you said today spoke to me. Thank you both. So sweet. Ray McNulty said, I am called. I think I'll be seeing you on Monday. Are the lectures and coaching calls available when you can or at a set time? Everett, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so all the lectures are delivered. None of the lectures are live. They've already been recorded. They're delivered once a week. And then the coaching calls are live but recorded. And they're alternated at different times so that we're hoping if you really want to be live. So if you don't want to be live on a call, you can send your question in ahead of time and I will still answer it. So you can still get your questions answered even if you're not live on the calls. But if you want to be live on a call, there might be a time that works for you. We're doing them on different times on Fridays so that we're hoping, just like these webinars, right? We got people from all over the world on this webinar because we did it so early in the day, or at least early for me. So if you can be on something live, great. That's the Q&A calls or the witness parts work sessions. And if you can't, don't worry about it because it's all recorded. So you'll have access to it.
Linda sounds like she knows what she's talking about. She says, Everett, do you teach unburdening of our exiles in Bright Line Freedom?
I certainly do. And it's really something that's done towards the end of I won't get It's like unburdening. What's that? So unburdening is the healing process. You know, these wounded parts of us carry what we call burdens, the extreme beliefs and the pain from the experiences. And you're going to actually learn techniques for transforming those wounds. That's part of why this work is so effective, is we actually go in and, if it's possible, heal our wounded parts. And when we heal a wounded part, all the protective system that's built up around it can relax. And then, suddenly you have a deeper access to your authentic self. And that issue is no longer an issue, or it's been really changed for you.
So I'll just share something. It's when you said extreme beliefs, these wounded parts hold these extreme beliefs. I'll just share something that just happened. I think people will resonate with it. I just dropped a friend off at the airport. He's the videographer for Bright Line Eating, and we've become friends because he's been doing video work for me for 4 years now. And we had a bunch of videos to shoot. So I just dropped him off at the airport. And as we were driving there, he was sharing some stuff that was like, it was kind of heavy, but it was emotional, and it was his stuff, you know, from his childhood and his life and whatever. And he texted me afterwards. He's like, I feel like I just dumped a lot of stuff on you. And I was like, not really. We had a really sweet conversation. Like, I didn't feel dumped on at all. And I realized he was sharing some loneliness. He was sharing that he was lonely. And now, as you talk, Everett, the story I make up in my head is he has a wounded child part that, for whom that's a really big issue, feeling lonely. Like, his mom was an alcoholic. And I imagine he felt lonely a lot as a kid because she wouldn't have been present for him, right? And so for him, do you ever have this where someone's like, I feel like they think it's such a big deal, right? And you're like, that was fine. Our interaction was totally normal. Like, we had a sweet connection. You were sharing a little emotionality. I received it. I was a good friend, you know, but he left feeling like he just exposed himself, right? And dumped all kinds of stuff on me. And I'm like, not really, you know? So our wounded parts, while it's still unhealed before the unburdening has happened, our parts hold these stories about, you know, how egregious or how huge this stuff is. Is that right, Everett? Am I kind of...
Yeah, I mean, so Richard Schwartz says, you know, our wounds we call them exiles, and in IFS, are frozen in scenes from the past.
Mm.
They're frozen in those scenes from the past. And so, you know, you may have just been having a conversation in present time for him, but that part of him from the past was like fully activated again. And that's part of what we do. And when we heal parts, is we go back to the past and we rescue those parts. We rescue those parts, bring them out of those places that they're stuck in.
Sweet. Gladiana Franca has a great question. She says she doesn't do meditation because of religious reasons. Will this hinder her from taking the course?
You know, I'm so supportive of everyone's spirituality, right? That you certainly won't hear anything from me in the content discouraging you. And, you know, one of the things you can do with the guided, so I do a lot of guided meditations because a lot of this is about kind of going inside and experiencing your parts. And you can really do those all as journaling exercises. So instead of doing a meditation where you have a dialogue with your parts, just go in and journal about it. You know, so you can not really have to go into that process of being in a meditation. So, so I think no one's asked before, so I'm just kind of thinking about it right now that, if for some reason you did not want to like do a meditation, but you're willing to listen to what sounds like a guided meditation where I'm asking you questions to ask your parts, and then you can just journal it. And then some people don't like guided. They don't work for them, right? And so they just do journaling anyway. That works for them.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, there's always a workaround.
Yeah.
And the meditation, the guided meditations aren't a huge part of the course. Like, you would still get tremendous value out of the course if you just didn't even do them at all, right?
Oh, Yeah, and I like to start my lectures with a meditation. Just don't do it or fast forward.
Yeah. MK Nunley says, what about confidentiality? Is it directed or expected that people will keep your business private in the online group? You mentioned listening in on someone undergoing direct counseling.
Yeah, so there's something we do called witness parts work sessions, and when we do those, people understand that people are going to be listening to those, and so no one's ever having their content published without their knowledge, and people actually like to do those. There's something very powerful that happens when you're witnessed in healing. It's really profound actually. And so, in terms of Facebook confidentiality, I would treat it like any other thing. Like, don't put something on Facebook that you don't want the world possibly to know. Obviously those groups are secret. People are respectful, but there's no time where we're actually pushing out people's private content in a way that would be an issue. And the witness parts work sessions are, people sign release forms saying it's okay. Like, there's a real process to make sure they're very okay with, releasing that.
Do you, at the beginning of the course, talk about confidentiality and?
Yeah, in a general sense, that
Yeah.
you would do it in like any retreat or talk about healing. And obviously with a huge number of people, you can't actually control that, right?
Yes.
But you can create an intention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So MK says I'm talking about the listeners recognizing names or discussing outside of the group.
Yeah. So on parts work sessions, right, people have the option to use a different name if they want. Like, we create a kind of people. It's kind of an honor to be chosen for those. People like doing those witness parts work sessions. But in terms of a lockdown on it, there's it's like Gideon games or something, right? I mean, you're dealing with individuals who are caring and have the same issues, and some people have things that that are very private, and so they wouldn't bring up in any sort of forum where people they don't know would be interacting with them. So so I think there's a reasonable focus on that, but obviously you can't actually control hundreds of people in that way.
Yeah. Edward just commented, you answered my question, and I realized if I do this Brightline Freedom, I need to do more 12-step writing, so thank you. I now realize that I did my OA 12-step program and have seen a therapist, but I realize now that I have hidden issues not addressed. So thank you, Susan, for creating this program.
Oh.
You're welcome, Edward. I think it's going to be really helpful. You mentioned the anger and that protective part, the sexual abuse, and then the anger, protecting that inner child. I think it's going to be really helpful.
Yeah.
And Kay says, thanks. I have no idea what the Gideon games are, so I will look it up afterwards. That's a program within Bright Lifers. It's like a contest that happens, but we form groups of 10 people. So you have potentially 10 people that you could be sharing, 9 other people that you could be sharing personal stuff with, potentially, right? But let's back up here because Jill had a question. What if I purchased the BLE bootcamp a year ago and I still haven't started it? Which would you recommend would be best? Obviously, I am resistant to Brightline eating, but I feel drawn to Brightline Freedom. In your case, Jill, I think Brightline Freedom is the way to start. You say you feel drawn to Brightline Freedom, and that the Brightline Freedom will help you understand your resistant part.
Right.
Like, you feel called to Brightline eating, but you've got a part, maybe a rebellious part or a resistant part. You've got some sort of wary protector part in here that's not letting you actually dive in. And Brightline Freedom will help you start there and say, okay, what's that about, first of all, right? Like, you need help even getting in the door of Brightline eating. And since you purchased the bootcamp a year ago, it's just sitting on the shelf. It's not going anywhere. You can start that later if Brightline Freedom gets you to the point where you're like, all right, now I'm ready to dive into the bootcamp. So,
and it was my second boot. I did a boot camp. The first boot camp I did watched the first video and then was just sucked back into the chaos of my life. right, you know, like, and then I'm just back in my overwhelm and busyness, and then it was my second boot camp I did like 4 months later that I actually did the boot camp. It just cracks me up when I think back on it, but it's so me.
Yeah. I see the questions are slowing way down. Last chance. Anyone have any questions? And as I ask that, I just want to remind everyone that the course starts Monday, Brightline Freedom. And I just want to invite everyone here to check in with their highest authentic self. Do you feel called to do this work? Very deep inner work that helps you understand your inner landscape. And if you're on a food journey, like Brightline Eating helps you really get clear and do it from a place of highest self, which is not the white knuckling feeling of the food controller, right? It's a very, just a really easy way of sticking with the bright lines, and can help so many other areas of your life as well: work and relationships and healthy habits and wounds from the past and so much. Okay. Let's see here. A few more people wrote in a couple more things. MK says, can we sign up later on the Brightline Eating website or only right now here? You can't sign up on the Brightline Eating website, but if you're here on this webinar, you'll get an email tomorrow. I guess tomorrow would be the last day. And you can sign up through your email tomorrow. So if you want a night to think about it, you can think about it for another night. I don't recommend that though. And here's why. Your highest self is here resonating right now. And my estimation is that the parts that would talk you out of it over the next day are likely not the parts that are your highest, most authentic self, right? They're the worried parts, the fearful parts, the parts that, you know, aren't sure you're going to show up, aren't sure you can do it, blah, 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 right? Most of us have chatter in our head, like the vast majority of us have chatter in our head that over time sort of undermines us. So if you feel called to do it, like really deep down, you feel called to do it, I think you should just sign up and do it. Throw your knapsack over the wall and sign up and do it. That would be my suggestion. Okay. Okay. Someone just wrote in about a payment plan. Yeah, go to support.brightlineeating.com, support.brightlineeating.com, and reach out to my support team is what you should do. Gail just registered for the program, and Everett, she wants to know how to register or log in on the Brightline Freedom website.
Well, you'll be getting emails that are going to guide you through all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. Sarah Magnan says, we're mostly a very respectful and loving group of participants. She wanted to chime in on the confidentiality question.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. It's never come up as an issue. And I would be curious if someone's overly concerned about that, if they have an isolator that's really kind of bringing up lots of fear around, like, oh, but what about this or what about that?
Yeah, totally. All right. I think we have answered the questions. Everett, it's always such a treat to be with you.
I know. Yeah.
So much. Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you for spending this time with us. Everett and I are sending so much love. We're going to sign off. And yeah, you have the link right here. Just click on the button at least so you get the page that comes up so you can have it to fill out your registration if that's what you are called to do. We'll see you in Brightline Freedom. And thanks for spending this time with us. You will get a replay link for this webinar. So if you want to watch it again tonight or tomorrow, or probably Monday morning, you can still do that. All right, everyone. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Oh, just real quick before I end it, someone said, I'm trying to register right now, having a problem. If anyone has a problem with registering or anything like that, just go to my support team, support.brightlineeating.com. Go to that website, support.brightlineeating.com, and my team can help you out with anything that you need after this webinar ends. All right. Bye, everyone.